Welcome, Guardian of Shadows, to a journey through the blood-stained streets of Gotham City, where ancient dynasties built empires upon foundations of fear and corruption, where family names became synonymous with power carved from darkness itself. Tonight, we shall explore the criminal bloodlines that shaped the city's underworld, from Italian patriarchs who ruled like kings to secret societies that pulled strings from shadows deeper than any alley. Close your eyes, protector of the night, and let these tales of loyalty twisted into betrayal, of honor corrupted by greed, carry you into peaceful slumber as we chronicle every crime family that has ever called Gotham home. In the beginning, before the red and blue of Superman blazed across metropolis skies, before the green and black of a dark night cast shadows across Gotham's rooftops, there existed in the city's heart an empire built not upon alien strength or vigilante justice, but upon something far more human and far more enduring: family loyalty twisted into criminal enterprise, blood bonds forged into chains of corruption that would strangle the city for decades. This is the tale of the Falcone crime family, known throughout the underworld as the Roman Empire, a dynasty that ruled Gotham's darkness with the same imperial authority that their namesake ancestors had once exercised over the Mediterranean world. The story begins not in the gleaming towers of legitimate business or the marble halls of political power, but in the narrow streets of Gotham's Italian district, where Carmine Falcone was born into circumstances that seemed destined to breed either saints or sinners, and where the choice between law and lawlessness was often determined not by moral conviction, but by simple opportunity and the human hunger for respect in a world that offered little to those born without advantage. Even as a child, Carmine possessed qualities that marked him as different from his peers, not the kind of obvious physical strength that commanded attention through intimidation, but rather the subtler and more dangerous gift of understanding people's desires and fears, of seeing the invisible connections that bound the city's power structure together, like a vast web of mutual obligation and carefully balanced threats. The young Falcone displayed from his earliest years the combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that would eventually make him the most powerful crime lord in Gotham's history. Yet these qualities were initially channeled not toward criminal enterprise, but toward the legitimate pursuits that his immigrant family hoped would lift them from poverty into respectability. His parents, who had crossed an ocean in search of opportunities that the old country could not provide, viewed education and hard work as the keys to achieving the American dream, and they invested their meager resources in ensuring that their son would have access to the knowledge and skills necessary for success in their adopted homeland. Yet the America that Carmine Falcone encountered as he came of age was not the meritocratic paradise that his parents' generation had imagined, but rather a complex hierarchy where success often depended less upon honest effort than upon one's willingness to navigate the grey areas between legal and illegal enterprise, where the line between legitimate business and organized crime was frequently blurred beyond recognition. The Prohibition era that defined his formative years created opportunities for extraordinary wealth and power for those bold enough to provide goods and services that the government had declared illegal, but that the public continued to demand with undiminished enthusiasm. The transformation from ambitious young man seeking legitimate success to crime lord commanding an empire built upon fear and violence was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather a gradual process of moral compromise that began with small favors for family friends and evolved through a series of increasingly serious criminal enterprises that drew him deeper into the underworld with each passing year. The bootlegging operation that first brought Falcone to the attention of established crime families was presented to him not as a criminal conspiracy but as a business opportunity, a chance to provide a valuable service to customers who were being denied access to products they desired by what he was taught to view as unjust and unenforceable legislation. The skills that Falcone developed during his apprenticeship in illegal alcohol distribution would serve him well throughout his criminal career, for the business of bootlegging required not only courage and organizational ability, but also the diplomatic talents necessary to maintain relationships with suppliers, distributors, law enforcement officials, and politicians whose cooperation was essential for successful operations. The young man who had once dreamed of achieving respectability through conventional means discovered that the criminal underworld offered forms of recognition and influence that legitimate society would never have granted to someone of his background and circumstances. The establishment of what would become known as the Roman Empire began in the years following Prohibition's end, when Falcone recognized that the organizational skills and political connections he had developed during his bootlegging career could be applied to other forms of criminal enterprise that would prove more durable than the temporary opportunities created by specific legislative restrictions. The gambling operations, loan sharking businesses, and protection rackets that formed the foundation of his empire were designed not to exploit temporary legal loopholes, but to provide ongoing services that would generate steady income, regardless of changes in government policy or public attitudes. The genius of Falcone's approach to organized crime lay in his understanding that true power came not from the ability to commit acts of violence, though such capability was certainly necessary, but from the capacity to make oneself indispensable to the legitimate power structure while remaining invisible to those who might seek to challenge his authority. His empire was built upon relationships rather than territory, upon obligations and favors rather than simple intimidation, creating a network of influence that penetrated every level of Gotham's political, business, and social hierarchy. The name Roman that Falcone adopted as his criminal persona reflected not merely ethnic pride, but a sophisticated understanding of the parallels between his own empire and the classical civilization that had once dominated the known world. Through a combination of military might, political acumen, and cultural influence, like the ancient Romans, Falcone understood that lasting power required not only the ability to conquer, but also the wisdom to govern, not merely the capacity to destroy opposition, but the skill to transform enemies into allies through carefully calibrated combinations of reward and punishment. The early years of Falcone's reign as Gotham's crime lord were marked by a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity for those fortunate enough to operate under his protection, as his diplomatic approach to conflict resolution and his emphasis on maintaining positive relationships with law enforcement officials created conditions that minimized the kind of violent warfare that had characterized previous eras of organized crime in the city. The peace that prevailed during this golden age was not the result of weakness or complacency, but rather the product of careful planning and strategic thinking that recognized violence as a tool to be employed judiciously rather than a first resort to every challenge. The organizational structure that Falcone created to manage his expanding empire reflected his understanding of the importance of delegation and specialization in maintaining control over complex operations that spanned multiple industries and geographical areas. Each lieutenant in his organization was granted significant autonomy within their assigned sphere of responsibility, while being held accountable for results that contributed to the overall success of the family's enterprises, creating a system that combined efficiency with loyalty through carefully balanced incentives and consequences. The relationship between the Falcone organization and Gotham's legitimate business community was characterized by a form of symbiosis that benefited both parties while maintaining the appearance of legal separation that protected respectable businessmen from direct association with criminal activity. The services that Falcone provided to legitimate enterprises ranged from labor dispute resolution and debt collection to more subtle forms of market manipulation and competitive advantage that helped his allies prosper while ensuring their labor continued dependence upon his organization's capabilities. The political connections that Falcone cultivated throughout his career were based not upon crude bribery or simple corruption, but upon a sophisticated understanding of the mutual benefits that could flow from cooperation between organized crime and elected officials who required stability and predictability in their jurisdictions to maintain their own positions of authority. The crime lord's ability to control street-level criminal activity, to prevent the kind of random violence that generated negative publicity, and to channel illegal enterprises into forms that minimized public disruption, made him a valuable if unofficial partner in maintaining civic order. The Wayne family's relationship with Carmine Falcone represented one of the most complex and morally ambiguous aspects of the crime lord's empire, for it demonstrated how even the most respectable and philanthropic members of Gotham's elite could become entangled with criminal enterprises when circumstances demanded pragmatic solutions to problems that legal institutions were unable or unwilling to address effectively. The mutual respect that developed between Thomas Wayne and Carmine Falcone was based not upon shared criminal interests, but upon recognition of each other's dedication to protecting their families and their community according to their different but not incompatible value systems. The medical assistance that Dr. Thomas Wayne provided to Falcone during a critical moment in the crime lord's career created a bond of obligation that would have profound consequences for both families in subsequent years, demonstrating how acts of compassion and professional duty could create connections that transcended the boundaries between legitimate and criminal society. The debt that Falcone felt he owed to the Wayne family would later manifest itself in forms of protection and assistance that were invisible to the public, but crucial to the family's security during times of crisis and vulnerability. The holiday murders that terrorized Gotham during Falcone's later years represented not merely a challenge to his organization's security, but a fundamental assault upon the principles of order and predictability that had made his empire possible, introducing elements of chaos and unpredictability that threatened to destroy the carefully maintained balance of power that had kept the city's criminal enterprises operating within acceptable boundaries. The systematic targeting of Falcone family members and associates during major holidays created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that undermined the confidence and loyalty upon which the organization depended for its continued effectiveness. The investigation into the holiday killings revealed the extent to which Falcone's empire had become integrated into Gotham's power structure, as the crime lord found himself working alongside law enforcement officials and legitimate businessmen who shared his interest in maintaining stability and preventing the kind of escalating violence that could attract unwanted federal attention to the city's affairs. The cooperation between former enemies in the face of a common threat demonstrated both the pragmatic flexibility that had made Falcone successful and the fundamental fragility of any system that depended upon the voluntary cooperation of individuals whose interests were ultimately incompatible. The emergence of Harvey Dent as a force for reform in Gotham's legal system represented a new form of challenge to Falcone's authority, one that could not be addressed through the traditional methods of bribery, intimidation, or negotiation that had proven effective against previous threats to his organization. The young district attorney's genuine commitment to justice and his apparent immunity to corruption created a situation that required either elimination or accommodation, and Falcone's initial attempts to find common ground with Dent demonstrated his preference for diplomatic solutions, even when dealing with implacable opposition. The Batman's arrival in Gotham marked the beginning of the end for Falcone's empire. Though the crime lord initially underestimated the threat posed by what he assumed was simply another costumed vigilante who could be handled through conventional methods of intimidation and violence. The Dark Knight's systematic assault upon the infrastructure of organized crime, combined with his apparent invulnerability to the forms of retaliation that had proven effective against previous enemies, forced Falcone to adapt strategies and tactics that had served him well for decades to address a completely unprecedented form of opposition. The psychological warfare that Batman employed against Falcone's organization was perhaps more effective than direct physical confrontation in undermining the crime lord's authority, as the mysterious nature of the vigilante's capabilities and the impossibility of predicting his actions created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made it increasingly difficult for Falcone to maintain the confidence of his subordinates and allies. The fear that Batman inspired was not merely concern about physical harm, but anxiety about the unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of a force that operated according to rules that no one fully understood. The alliance between Batman, Harvey Dent, and Commissioner Gordon, that came to be known as the Triumvirate, represented a coordinated assault upon organized crime that attacked Falcone's empire from multiple directions simultaneously, combining legal prosecution, police investigation, and vigilante action in ways that made it impossible for the crime lord to develop effective countermeasures against any single threat. The cooperation between these three figures demonstrated that reform was possible when individuals with different capabilities and resources were willing to subordinate their personal interests to a shared commitment to justice. The downfall of Carmine Falcone was ultimately the result not of external pressure, but of internal contradictions within his own organization and family, as the stress of operating under constant threat from Batman and law enforcement officials exacerbated existing tensions and rivalries that had been suppressed during more prosperous times. The loyalty that had been maintained through a combination of fear, respect, and mutual benefit began to erode as the costs of association with the Falcone name began to outweigh the advantages, and former allies began to consider alternative arrangements that might provide greater security and opportunity. The murder of Carmine Falcone by Harvey Dent, transformed into the vengeful Two-Face, represented not merely the death of an individual but the symbolic end of an era in Gotham's criminal history, the conclusion of a chapter that had been defined by the assumption that organized crime could coexist peacefully with legitimate society if it operated according to certain unwritten rules and maintained certain boundaries. The chaos that followed Falcone's death demonstrated how completely his personal authority had been integrated into the structure of his organization, and how difficult it was to transfer such personalized power to successors who lacked his unique combination of skills and experience. Sofia Falcone's attempt to assume control of her father's empire represented both the strength of family loyalty within criminal organizations and the ultimate futility of trying to maintain power through inherited authority rather than demonstrated capability, as her brief and violent reign demonstrated that the respect commanded by Carmine Falcone could not be automatically transferred to his descendants regardless of their determination or ruthlessness. Her murder at the hands of the hangman brought to a definitive end any possibility that the Falcone organization could be restored to its former prominence and influence. The legacy of the Roman Empire extended far beyond the immediate impact of its criminal enterprises to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of organized crime in Gotham City. as subsequent criminal organizations would be forced to operate in an environment where the traditional assumptions about the relationship between crime and legitimate society had been permanently altered by the conflicts that destroyed the Falcone family. The peace and stability that had characterized Carmine Falcone's reign would never be restored, as the city's underworld fragmented into competing factions that lacked both the vision and the capability to recreate the unified authority that had once made organized crime a stabilizing rather than disruptive force into Gotham's political and social landscape. The Roman Empire's influence upon the development of Batman's mission and methods was profound and lasting, as the Dark Knight's understanding of justice, order, and the proper relationship between power and responsibility was shaped through his conflicts with an organization that represented both the seductive appeal of efficiency achieved through extra-legal means and the ultimate corruption that such approaches inevitably produced. The lessons learned through his war against the Falcone family would inform Batman's approach to all subsequent encounters with organized crime, teaching him both the importance of addressing the social conditions that made such organizations possible and the necessity of remaining vigilant against the temptation to employ their methods in service of supposedly noble goals. In the shadowed alleys where honor was currency and blood feuds were inheritance, there arose alongside the Roman Empire another dynasty whose name would become synonymous with brutality, refined into art, with violence elevated to the level of philosophy. This was the realm of the Moroni crime family, whose approach to criminal enterprise stood in stark contrast to the diplomatic sophistication of their Falcone rivals, yet whose influence upon Gotham's underworld was no less profound or enduring. Where Carmine Falcone had built his empire upon relationships and mutual obligation, the Moroni family constructed their power upon the foundation of fear made absolute, respect earned through demonstrations of ruthless capability that left no doubt about the consequences of opposition or betrayal. The origins of the Moroni dynasty stretched back to the same waves of Italian immigration that had brought the Falcone family to America's shores, yet the circumstances and character of their founder would shape the organization along entirely different philosophical lines that reflected not the calculated pragmatism of political accommodation, but the ancient codes of honor, vengeance that had governed Mediterranean feuds for centuries, before civilization had learned to disguise warfare behind legal institutions and diplomatic protocols. Luigi Moroni, known throughout the underworld as Big Lou, possessed neither the subtle intelligence that had made Carmine Falcone such an effective manipulator of legitimate society, nor the patient temperament that allowed for long-term strategic planning. Yet, what he lacked in sophistication, he more than compensated for through sheer force of personality and an absolute commitment to the principle that respect could only be maintained through the willingness to employ overwhelming violence against anyone who dared to challenge his authority. The younger Moroni's approach to criminal enterprise was shaped by experiences during his formative years that had taught him to view the world as fundamentally divided between predators and prey, between those strong enough to take what they desired and those weak enough to have it taken from them, with no middle ground available for those who sought to navigate between these extremes through compromise or negotiation. The poverty and discrimination that his family had endured during their early years in America had convinced him that legitimate society would never willingly grant respect or opportunity to those marked by their foreign origins and working-class backgrounds, making it necessary to seize through force what would never be offered through fairness. The bootlegging operations that first brought the Moroni family to prominence during Prohibition were characterized by a level of open warfare and territorial aggression that stood in marked contrast to the more subtle and diplomatic approaches favored by their competitors, as Big Lou believed that the surest way to discourage opposition was to demonstrate through dramatic examples that any challenge to Moroni authority would result in swift and disproportionate retaliation. The speakeasies and distribution networks that comprised the foundation of their empire were defended not through political corruption or negotiated agreements, but through the simple expedient of eliminating anyone who attempted to interfere with their operations, creating a reputation for ruthless efficiency that both attracted ambitious subordinates and discouraged potential rivals from testing their resolve. The philosophy that guided Moroni criminal enterprise was rooted in old-world concepts of honor and vendetta that recognized no distinction between personal and business relationships, viewing every interaction as a test of strength and will that would determine the relative positions of all parties involved in the hierarchy of respect that governed underworld society. This approach created an organizational culture that was simultaneously more personally loyal and more inherently unstable than the systems developed by their competitors, as subordinates who proved their worth through demonstrations of courage and capability could rise rapidly through the ranks, while those who showed weakness or disloyalty faced immediate and permanent removal from positions of trust. The relationship between the Moroni and Falcone families during their respective rises to power was characterized not by the kind of territorial warfare that might have been expected between competing criminal organizations, but rather by a complex dynamic of mutual respect and carefully maintained hostility that reflected both their need to avoid the kind of open conflict that would attract unwanted law enforcement attention, and their recognition that each family's approach to criminal enterprise served different functions within Gotham's underworld ecosystem. The Moronis provided the muscle and intimidation that made negotiated settlements possible, while the Falcons offered the political connections and legitimate business relationships that allowed criminal enterprises to operate with minimal interference from official oversight. The transition from Big Lou's leadership to that of his son Salvatore represented not merely a change in personnel, but a fundamental shift in the family's approach to criminal enterprise, as the younger Moroni brought to his inherited position a combination of his father's commitment to violence as a tool of authority and a more sophisticated understanding of the political and economic forces that shaped criminal opportunities in a rapidly changing urban environment. Salvatore Moroni, known throughout the underworld as Sal the Italian, possessed the intelligence necessary to recognize that pure brutality, while essential for maintaining respect within criminal circles, was insufficient for building the kind of lasting power that could survive changes in law enforcement priorities and political administrations. The early years of Sal Moroni's reign as head of the family were marked by a systematic campaign to expand their operations beyond the traditional boundaries of Italian neighborhoods and into the broader Gotham criminal marketplace, using a combination of strategic violence and carefully negotiated alliances to establish footholds in enterprises that had previously been controlled by other ethnic organizations or independent operators. The success of these expansion efforts demonstrated that the Moroni approach to criminal enterprise, properly applied, could be as effective as the more subtle methods employed by their rivals, though it required a constant willingness to escalate conflicts to levels of violence that more diplomatically inclined criminal leaders preferred to avoid. The relationship between Sal Moroni and Harvey Dent represented one of the most significant and tragic connections in Gotham's criminal history, not because of any alliance or cooperation between the prosecutor and the crime lord, but rather because of the devastating personal consequences that flowed from their courtroom confrontation during the trial that was intended to mark the beginning of the end for organized crime's influence over the city's legal system. The decision to prosecute Moroni personally rather than delegating the case to subordinate attorneys, reflected Dent's understanding that symbolic victories against high-profile criminal leaders were necessary to demonstrate that law enforcement officials possessed both the capability and the courage to challenge even the most dangerous elements of Gotham's underworld. The acid attack that transformed Harvey Dent from crusading prosecutor into the vengeful Two-Face was not merely a desperate attempt by a cornered criminal to escape justice, but rather the inevitable result of a worldview that recognized only victory or defeat as acceptable outcomes to any significant confrontation, with no possibility of compromise or negotiation available once the battle lines had been clearly drawn. Maroney's decision to attempt the murder of a sitting district attorney in open court demonstrated both his complete contempt for legal institutions and his understanding that half measures in dealing with existential threats were more dangerous than the most extreme responses, regardless of their long-term consequences. The bottle of acid that Maroney hurled across the courtroom carried with it more than just the chemical agents that would permanently disfigure Harvey Dent's face and psyche. It bore the accumulated weight of generations of old-world feuds and Mediterranean concepts of honor that recognized no authority higher than personal vendetta and family loyalty, transforming what should have been a routine legal proceeding into a moment of violence so shocking and symbolically significant that it would permanently alter the landscape of criminal justice in Gotham City. The scarring of Harvey Dent represented not merely the corruption of an individual prosecutor, but the symbolic destruction of the idealistic belief that legal institutions possessed sufficient moral authority to command respect from those who had chosen to place themselves outside the boundaries of legitimate society. The transformation of Harvey Dent into Two-Face created for Sal Maroney an enemy whose commitment to revenge was every bit as absolute and uncompromising as his own philosophy of criminal enterprise, yet whose methods and resources were enhanced by intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedures and legal institutions that made him uniquely dangerous to organized crime operations that had previously felt secure from official interference. The irony that Maroney's attack had created precisely the kind of opponent who posed the greatest possible threat to his continued survival and freedom was lost on a criminal whose worldview did not accommodate the possibility that actions might have unintended consequences that proved more significant than their immediate tactical objectives. The imprisonment of Sal Maroney following his conviction for the acid attack represented a temporary victory for law enforcement officials who had struggled for years to gather sufficient evidence to prosecute high-level, organized crime figures. Yet the celebratory atmosphere that surrounded his incarceration proved premature, as the crime lord's incarceration provided him with opportunities to expand his influence within the prison system while maintaining control over his barrios, street operations through a network of loyal subordinates who had been carefully prepared for the possibility that their leader might face extended periods of forced absence. The criminal enterprises that operated under Maroney direction during his imprisonment demonstrated both the organizational strength that he had built into his family structure and the continued relevance of his philosophical approach to criminal enterprise. In an environment where violence remained the ultimate arbiter of disputes and hierarchies, the assassination of Sal Maroney within the supposedly secure confines of the state penitentiary represented not merely the elimination of a dangerous criminal, but the symbolic conclusion of an era in Gotham's underworld history that had been defined by the assumption that personal courage and willingness to employ violence were sufficient qualifications for criminal leadership, regardless of changes in law enforcement capabilities or the evolving sophistication of legitimate business and political institutions. The murder was carried out not by rival criminals seeking to eliminate competition, but by agents of the very system that he had spent his career challenging, demonstrating that even the most ruthless and capable criminal leaders were ultimately vulnerable to forces that operated according to different rules and possessed resources that individual organizations could not match. The circumstances surrounding Moroni's death revealed the extent to which his organization's emphasis on personal loyalty and direct confrontation had made it vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation by enemies who understood that traditional criminal codes of honor could be exploited by those willing to operate without regard for the unwritten rules that governed underworld behavior. The guards and inmates who participated in his assassination were motivated not by the kind of criminal rivalries that had defined earlier conflicts, but by forms of institutional corruption that transcended traditional boundaries between legitimate and criminal authority, creating hybrid forms of violence that combined official sanction with criminal methodology. The fragmentation of the Moroni crime family following Sal's assassination demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of an organizational structure that had been built around the personal authority and charismatic leadership of a single individual whose removal from the scene left his subordinates without the ideological framework or institutional relationships necessary to maintain unity and purpose. In the face of challenges from both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies that sensed opportunity, the power vacuum created by his death, the various factions that emerged from the collapse of unified Moroni authority represented different interpretations of the family's criminal philosophy, yet none possessed either the personal stature or the organizational resources necessary to recreate the empire that had been destroyed through their leader's removal. The absorption of surviving Moroni operations into the Falcone organization represented more than simply the expansion of one crime family at the expense of another, but rather the triumph of one approach to criminal enterprise over its philosophical opposite, as the diplomatic and politically sophisticated methods that had made Carmine Falcone successful proved more adaptable to changing circumstances than the more direct and confrontational tactics that had characterized Moroni family operations. The integration of former Moroni soldiers into Falcone crews required careful management to prevent the kind of cultural conflicts that might have undermined the stability of both organizations. Yet the process ultimately strengthened the Roman Empire by providing it with capabilities and resources that complemented rather than competed with its existing strengths. The lessons learned from the rise and fall of the Moroni crime family would influence the development of subsequent criminal organizations in Gotham City, as future leaders recognized both the effectiveness of violence as a tool for establishing authority and the ultimate limitations of any approach to criminal enterprise that relied too heavily upon intimidation without developing the political relationships and legitimate business connections necessary for long-term survival. The Moroni legacy served as both inspiration and cautionary tale for ambitious criminals who understood that success in organized crime required not merely courage and ruthlessness, but also the strategic thinking and adaptability that could navigate the complex relationships between criminal, enterprise, and legitimate society. The impact of the Moroni family upon Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face created ripple effects throughout Gotham's criminal justice system that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of the acid attack. As the prosecutor's disfigurement and subsequent descent into vigilante violence demonstrated the personal costs that reform efforts could exact upon those who chose to challenge organized crime directly rather than seeking accommodation through political compromise or institutional reform. The symbolic significance of Dent's fate served as a warning to other law enforcement officials about the dangers of underestimating criminal organizations or assuming that legal institutions possessed adequate protection against enemies who operated without regard for conventional rules or boundaries. The relationship between the Moroni family and the broader Italian-American community in Gotham represented one of the most complex and troubling aspects of ethnic organized crime, as the family's criminal activities inevitably reflected upon and influenced public perceptions of legitimate Italian immigrants and their descendants who had no connection to illegal enterprises, but who found themselves subject to suspicion and discrimination based upon their shared cultural background. The tension between ethnic pride and criminal reputation created internal conflicts within Italian neighborhoods that were never fully resolved, as community leaders struggled to distance themselves from criminal activities while also defending their cultural heritage against stereotypes and prejudices that painted all Italians as potential criminals. The code of honor that governed Moroni family operations was both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness, providing a framework for organizational loyalty and personal courage that enabled them to compete effectively against rivals, while also creating inflexibilities and vulnerabilities that more adaptable enemies could exploit. The emphasis on personal reputation and direct confrontation that characterized their approach to criminal enterprise made them formidable opponents in situations that could be resolved through superior violence or intimidation, yet left them disadvantaged when facing challenges that required subtlety, patience, or the ability to operate through intermediaries and legitimate institutions. The legacy of Sal Moroni's acid attack upon Harvey Dent resonated throughout Gotham's underworld as both a demonstration of the lengths to which cornered criminals might go to avoid justice and a warning about the unintended consequences that could flow from desperate actions undertaken without consideration of their broader implications. The transformation of a crusading prosecutor into a coin-flipping vigilante represented a form of victory that proved more costly to organized crime than any conventional defeat, as Two-Face's subsequent activities would prove far more destructive to criminal enterprises than Harvey Dent's legal prosecutions had ever been. The economic impact of Moroni family operations upon Gotham's legitimate business community was both more direct and more disruptive than the subtler forms of influence exercised by more diplomatically inclined criminal organizations, as their preference for intimidation over negotiation created instabilities and uncertainties that made normal business planning and investment decisions increasingly difficult for companies operating in territories or industries that fell within their sphere of interest. The protection rackets and illegal gambling operations that provided the foundation for their criminal enterprise represented forms of taxation without representation that drained resources from legitimate economic activity while providing no corresponding benefits to the broader community. The international connections that linked the Moroni family to organized crime groups in Sicily and other parts of Italy provided them with resources and capabilities that extended their influence beyond the boundaries of Gotham City, yet also created vulnerabilities and obligations that sometimes forced them to prioritize external relationships over local interests, leading to conflicts and contradictions that ultimately weakened their position within the city's criminal hierarchy. The tension between old-world criminal traditions and new-world opportunities was never fully resolved within Moroni family operations, creating internal divisions that enemies could exploit and that prevented the organization from developing the kind of unified strategic vision necessary for long-term success. The philosophy of criminal enterprise that the Moroni family represented would continue to influence Gotham's underworld long after the organization itself had disappeared, as subsequent criminal leaders would face the same fundamental choice between accommodation and confrontation, between building power through relationships or through intimidation, between seeking stability through compromise or through the elimination of opposition. The example of both the Moroni family's successes and their ultimate failure provided lessons that would shape criminal strategy for generations, demonstrating both the potential effectiveness and the ultimate limitations of approaches to organized crime that relied primarily upon violence and personal authority, rather than institutional relationships and political sophistication. The blood that Sal Moroni spilled in that Gotham courtroom would stain far more than Harvey Dent's face, seeping into the very foundations of justice in a city where the line between law and lawlessness had already grown dangerously thin, where the acid of corruption had been eating away at institutional integrity for so long that a single bottle of chemicals could shatter the illusion that legal processes possessed sufficient moral authority to contain the forces of chaos that lurked beneath the surface of civilized society. In the end, the Moroni legacy was written not in the territories they controlled or the profits they generated, but in the scarred face of a man whose transformation from idealistic prosecutor to vengeful vigilante would serve as an eternal reminder that in Gotham City, the pursuit of justice could exact a price that even the most dedicated servants of the law might find too terrible to bear. In the shadowed territories where old world traditions cast long shadows across new world ambitions, where ancient bloodlines carried both honor and vengeance across oceanic distances to plant their roots in foreign soil, there flourished a criminal enterprise that embodied the deepest mysteries of Sicilian culture and Mediterranean power. This was the realm of Cosa Nostra, the sacred thing, the organization whose very name whispered of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud, of bonds forged not merely through criminal association, but through oaths that bound men's souls to purposes that transcended individual life and death. In the labyrinthine alleys of Gotham's East End, where the scent of olive oil and garlic mingled with the metallic tang of spilled blood, 5 families united under a single banner would create an empire that challenged even the Roman magnificence of the Falcones, yet whose internal contradictions and ancient grudges would ultimately consume them from within like a cancer that fed upon the very loyalty that made them strong. The origins of the Sicilian syndicate that would dominate Gotham's East End stretched back not merely to the immigration waves that brought Italian families to America's shores, but to feudal traditions and codes of honor that had governed Mediterranean society since before the rise of Rome itself, when justice was a personal responsibility rather than an institutional obligation, when a man's word was more binding than any legal contract, and when the failure to avenge an insult or injury brought shame not only upon the individual, but upon his entire bloodline for generations uncounted. These were not mere criminal organizations in any contemporary sense, but rather shadow governments that maintained their own systems of law and order, taxation and protection, diplomacy and warfare, operating according to principles that had been refined through centuries of survival in hostile environments where official authority was either absent or actively malevolent. The architectural foundation upon which Cosa Nostra built its American empire was the family structure that had sustained Sicilian society through countless foreign conquests and political upheavals, yet adapted and modified to address the unique challenges and opportunities presented by an urban environment where traditional agricultural relationships had been replaced by industrial commerce, and ethnic neighborhoods provided both protection and limitation for immigrant communities seeking to establish themselves in an often hostile new world. The 5 families that would comprise the syndicate were bound together not merely by criminal enterprise, but by intermarriage, shared history, and mutual obligations that created a web of relationships so complex and interconnected that betrayal of one family inevitably affected the stability and security of all the others. The visionary who first conceived of uniting these disparate Sicilian families into a single coordinated organization was Stefano Mandragora, a figure whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single city or even nation. Operating from his ancestral stronghold in Sicily, while maintaining networks of loyalty and obligation that spanned continents and penetrated the highest levels of both criminal and legitimate society. Mandragora understood that the fragmented nature of Sicilian criminal enterprises in America made them vulnerable to both law enforcement pressure and competition from other ethnic organizations. Yet he also recognized that their traditional suspicion of outsiders and emphasis on family autonomy made unity a goal that could only be achieved through careful diplomacy and the gradual building of trust among leaders whose primary loyalty had always been to their own immediate bloodlines. The man who would serve as Mandragora's instrument for creating this unprecedented alliance was Giuseppe Bertinelli, known throughout the East End as Joe the Boss, a figure whose personal charisma and strategic brilliance were matched only by his absolute commitment to the traditional codes of honor that governed Sicilian criminal enterprise, yet who possessed the vision and adaptability necessary to transform ancient feudal relationships into modern criminal corporations, capable of competing effectively against the Italian mainland families who had already established their dominance over much of Gotham's underworld. Bertinelli's understanding of American business practices and legal institutions provided him with tools that traditional Sicilian leaders lacked, while his unshakable commitment to old world values gave him credibility with family patriarchs who might otherwise have viewed adaptation as betrayal of their sacred traditions. The Prohibition era that defined Giuseppe Bertinelli's rise to power provided the perfect opportunity for demonstrating that coordinated action among the five families could generate profits and influence that exceeded anything achievable through individual family enterprises, as the massive demand for illegal alcohol created markets large enough to support multiple organizations, while requiring the kind of logistical coordination and territorial discipline that had always been the hallmark of successful Sicilian criminal enterprises. The bootlegging networks that Bertinelli established during this period were marvels of organizational efficiency that combined traditional Sicilian methods of ensuring loyalty and secrecy with American innovations in transportation, distribution, and financial management. The five families that comprised the heart of Bertinelli's syndicate each brought unique capabilities and resources to the alliance, while maintaining their individual identities and traditional areas of specialization, creating a structure that was simultaneously unified in its strategic direction and diversified in its operational capabilities, ensuring that the organization could adapt to changing circumstances and opportunities without sacrificing the cultural traditions and personal relationships that provided the foundation for its members' loyalty and dedication. The careful balance between cooperation and autonomy that characterized this arrangement reflected Bertinelli's understanding that lasting criminal organizations required both strong central leadership and respect for the traditions and prerogatives that gave individual families their sense of identity and purpose. The Bertinelli crime family itself occupied the position of first among equals within the syndicate, not merely because of Giuseppe's role as the architect of the alliance, but because of their strategic control over key transportation routes and their extensive relationships with both Sicilian suppliers and American distributors, making them indispensable intermediaries whose cooperation was essential for the successful operation of any large-scale criminal enterprise that required coordination between Old World sources and New World markets. The family's territories in the East End provided secure bases of operation, while their legitimate business interests in import-export operations offered perfect cover for more questionable activities. The tragic romance that would ultimately doom the Bertinelli family began as a strategic alliance designed to strengthen the syndicate's position within Gotham's broader criminal hierarchy, yet evolved into a genuine love story whose destruction would serve as the catalyst for one of the most brutal and senseless acts of violence in the city's underworld history, demonstrating how personal relationships and business obligations could become so intertwined that the failure of one inevitably led to the collapse of the other. Franco Bertinelli's marriage to Maria Panessa had been arranged not merely to unite two families, but to create a new generation of leaders who would combine the traditional virtues of Sicilian criminal culture with the adaptability and ambition necessary for success in an American environment that rewarded innovation and punished rigid adherence to outdated methods. The children born from this union were raised with full knowledge of their heritage and obligations, yet also educated in American schools and exposed to legitimate opportunities that previous generations of Sicilian criminals had never possessed, creating internal tensions and contradictions that reflected the broader challenges facing all immigrant communities as they struggled to maintain cultural identity while adapting to new social and economic realities. Helena Bertinelli's childhood was spent navigating between two worlds: the traditional Sicilian family culture that governed her home life, and the American middle-class environment that shaped her education and social relationships, creating psychological complexities that would influence her responses to the traumatic events that would soon shatter her family's security and happiness. The relationship between Santo Caso and Maria Bertinelli represented more than simply an extramarital affair between two individuals, but rather a fundamental violation of the codes of honor and family loyalty that provided the foundation for Sicilian criminal culture, creating obligations and resentments that would reverberate throughout the syndicate's membership and ultimately provide enemies with opportunities to exploit internal divisions that had been carefully concealed behind facades of unity and mutual respect. The discovery of this relationship by other family leaders created a crisis that threatened to destroy not merely individual families, but the entire alliance that Giuseppe Bertinelli had spent decades building and nurturing. The Caso family's involvement in heroin trafficking represented a significant departure from the traditional criminal enterprises that had sustained Sicilian families during their early years in America, introducing elements of corruption and violence that were fundamentally incompatible with the codes of honor that had previously governed their activities, yet which proved so profitable and strategically advantageous that resistance to their adoption gradually weakened, despite the moral reservations expressed by older family members who understood the long-term consequences of abandoning traditional limitations on criminal behavior. Santo Caso's willingness to engage in narcotics distribution demonstrated both his business acumen and his moral flexibility, qualities that made him valuable to the syndicate, while also creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The Galante family's control over Little Italy and their subsequent expansion into the East Side represented one of the most successful examples of territorial conquest and consolidation within the syndicate's history, demonstrating how traditional Sicilian methods of establishing authority through demonstrations of superior violence could be adapted to urban environments where territory was defined not by agricultural boundaries but by ethnic, neighborhoods and commercial districts, whose control provided access to both legitimate business opportunities and criminal enterprises. Junior Galante's leadership of his family combined old-world ruthlessness with new-world business sophistication, making him one of the most effective and dangerous criminal leaders in the syndicate's hierarchy. The massacre of the Beretti family at what should have been a joyous wedding celebration represented the kind of betrayal and violence that traditional Sicilian codes of honor were specifically designed to prevent yet which became inevitable once the bonds of loyalty and mutual respect that held the syndicate together began to weaken under the pressures of greed, ambition, and personal grudges that accumulated over years of cooperation that had never been based upon genuine friendship or shared values, but rather upon temporary alignments of interest and mutual fear of external enemies. The wedding that became a slaughter demonstrated how quickly celebration could transform into tragedy when ancient grudges were allowed to fester beneath surfaces of forced cooperation. The involvement of the Panessa family in the syndicate's affairs represented both the potential for expansion and the dangers of diluting traditional Sicilian criminal culture through the inclusion of families whose loyalty, commitment to established codes of conduct had not been tested, through generations of adversity and conflict, creating weak links in the chain of trust and mutual obligation that could be exploited by enemies who understood that hybrid organizations were always more vulnerable than those built upon homogeneous cultural foundations. Tommaso Panessa's desire to join the five families reflected legitimate ambition, yet also introduced elements of uncertainty and potential betrayal that traditional leaders viewed with suspicion and concern. The heroin trade that became increasingly central to syndicate operations during the post-war period represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Sicilian criminal enterprise, introducing elements of international cooperation and vast financial rewards that had never characterized traditional forms of organized crime, yet which also created dependencies and vulnerabilities that made the families subject to influences and pressures that extended far beyond their ability to control or even understand, transforming local criminal leaders into junior partners in global networks whose priorities and methods were often incompatible with Sicilian traditions and values. The profits generated by narcotics trafficking were so enormous that they corrupted the traditional relationships between families and created new hierarchies based upon financial contribution rather than respect and honor. The internal betrayals that ultimately destroyed the syndicate's unity reflected not merely personal grudges or business disputes, but fundamental contradictions between old-world concepts of honor and loyalty and new-world realities, of competition and individual advancement. As younger family members who had been educated in American schools and exposed to American values began to question traditional obligations and restrictions that seemed to limit their opportunities for personal success and social advancement, creating generational conflicts that enemy organizations could exploit to sow discord and division among families that had previously presented united fronts against external threats. The assassination of Franco Bertinelli and his family represented not merely the elimination of criminal rivals, but the symbolic destruction of the dream that old-world criminal traditions could be successfully adapted to new world conditions without losing their essential character and moral foundation, demonstrating that the attempt to maintain traditional codes of honor while engaging in increasingly dishonorable activities created contradictions that ultimately made such organizations vulnerable to the kind of internal collapse that no external enemy could have achieved through direct confrontation. The murder of an entire family, including innocent children, marked the crossing of lines that traditional Sicilian criminals had always respected, despite their willingness to employ violence in pursuit of their goals. The role of Stefano Mandragora in orchestrating the syndicate's destruction from his Sicilian stronghold demonstrated how old-world criminal leaders viewed their American counterparts not as equal partners, but as expendable assets, whose value lay primarily in their ability to generate profits that could be transferred back to Sicily, making them ultimately responsible to authorities whose priorities and perspectives had been shaped by entirely different historical and cultural experiences, creating inevitable conflicts between local interests and international obligations that weakened American families' ability to respond effectively to threats and opportunities within their own territories. The emergence of Helena Bertinelli as the Huntress represented both the personal consequences of the syndicate's collapse and the symbolic birth of a new form of justice that combined traditional Sicilian concepts of family honor and claims.com, personal vengeance with American ideals of individual responsibility and moral accountability, creating a hybrid approach to criminal justice that operated outside both official legal institutions and traditional criminal organizations, demonstrating how the destruction of established orders could create opportunities for entirely new forms of social organization and moral authority to emerge from the chaos left in their wake. The territorial disputes that erupted following the syndicate's fragmentation revealed the extent to which the five families' cooperation had been based upon imposed discipline rather than genuine mutual respect, as ancient grudges and competing claims to traditional territories created conflicts that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise, requiring the kind of violent resolution that traditional codes of honor demanded yet, which also ensured that the surviving families would be too weakened by internal warfare to mount effective resistance against external enemies who had been waiting patiently for opportunities to expand their own influence and control. The legacy of Cosa Nostra's brief dominance over Gotham's East End extended far beyond the immediate impact of their criminal enterprises to encompass broader questions about the relationship between cultural identity, criminal behavior, the possibility of maintaining traditional values in modern environments, and the ultimate incompatibility between codes of honor that demanded personal loyalty and business relationships that required calculated betrayal of competitors and rivals. The syndicate's collapse served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of attempting to preserve ancient traditions in contemporary contexts, without adapting them to address new realities and challenges. The influence of Sicilian criminal culture upon subsequent organized crime developments in Gotham City was both profound and lasting, as the methods and traditions that had been introduced by the five families continued to shape criminal enterprises long after the original organizations had been destroyed or absorbed by more successful rivals, demonstrating that cultural influences could survive the destruction of specific institutions and continue to affect social development through informal networks and shared values that transcended formal organizational boundaries. The codes of silence and loyalty that had governed syndicate operations became part of Gotham's criminal culture generally, influencing the behavior of criminals who had no direct connection to Sicilian families yet who recognized the practical advantages of traditional approaches to maintaining secrecy and discipline within illegal organizations. The transformation of the East End following the syndicate's collapse reflected broader changes in Gotham's demographic composition and economic structure, as the Italian neighborhoods that had provided secure bases for Sicilian families gradually evolved into more diverse communities where multiple ethnic groups competed for territory and influence, creating conditions that favored criminal organizations whose appeal and membership crossed traditional cultural boundaries, rather than those that remained restricted to specific immigrant communities, whose political and economic influence was declining relative to other groups within the city's population. The tragic irony of the Sicilian syndicate's story lay in the recognition that their commitment to maintaining traditional codes of honor and family loyalty, which should have been their greatest strength in building lasting criminal enterprises, ultimately became the source of vulnerabilities and contradictions that enemies could exploit to destroy them from within, demonstrating that in environments where survival required constant adaptation and moral flexibility, rigid adherence to ancient principles could become a form of weakness rather than strength, regardless of the nobility and historical significance of those traditions. The children who survived the massacre that ended the syndicate's power would carry forward not only personal desires for revenge, but also cultural memories and traditional knowledge that would influence their understanding of justice, loyalty, and moral responsibility in ways that official institutions could never fully appreciate or control, creating ongoing challenges for law enforcement agencies and rival criminal organizations that would have to deal with enemies whose motivations and methods had been shaped by experiences and traditions that extended far beyond contemporary criminal culture. The seeds of future conflicts had been planted in the blood-soaked soil of the East End, waiting for the proper conditions to sprout into new forms of vengeance and justice that would continue to shape Gotham's criminal landscape for generations yet to come. In the end, the Sicilian Syndicate's brief but violent reign over Gotham's East End served as both testament to the power of traditional criminal culture and demonstration of its ultimate inadequacy when faced with modern challenges that required forms of adaptation and moral flexibility that ancient codes of honor were never designed to accommodate, leaving behind ruins and memories that would haunt the city's underworld like ghostly reminders of roads not taken and dreams that had been transformed into nightmares through the inevitable corruption that attended any attempt to build order upon foundations of violence and fear. In the emerald mists that shrouded the docks where ships from distant shores brought more than cargo to Gotham's weathered piers, where ancient Celtic songs mingled with the harsh consonants of American ambition, there arose criminal dynasties whose roots stretched back through centuries of struggle against foreign oppression, whose understanding of loyalty and vengeance had been forged in the stone circles and peat bogs of Ireland, where resistance to authority was not merely political necessity, but sacred obligation passed down through generations who had learned that survival required the willingness to spill blood in defense of family honor and ancestral pride. These were the Irish crime families of Gotham, organizations whose approach to criminal enterprise reflected not the calculated sophistication of their Italian rivals, but the passionate intensity of a people whose history had taught them that justice was a personal responsibility, rather than an institutional promise. That respect could only be earned through demonstrations of courage that bordered on the suicidal, and that death was preferable to the kind of submission that foreign rulers had demanded from their ancestors for generations beyond counting. The Emerald Empire that would challenge the established order of Gotham's underworld began not with grand strategies or carefully negotiated alliances, but with the simple human desire to carve out spaces where Irish immigrants could live according to their own values and traditions, free from the discrimination and hostility that marked their reception in a city that had already been divided among various ethnic factions whose territorial claims and cultural prejudices left little room for newcomers who possessed neither the political connections nor the economic resources necessary for peaceful integration into existing power structures. The neighborhoods that became strongholds of Irish criminal enterprise were initially nothing more than enclaves where families sought refuge from a hostile world. Yet these same communities would eventually give birth to organizations whose influence and violence would reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in Gotham City. The Sullivan crime family, whose name would become synonymous with Irish criminal enterprise in Gotham, emerged from circumstances that perfectly illustrated the complex relationship between legitimate struggle and criminal opportunity that characterized the experience of working-class immigrants in early 20th century America, where the line between organized labor activism and criminal conspiracy was often determined more by political convenience than by any meaningful distinction between legal and illegal methods of pursuing economic justice and social Advancement. Mickey Sullivan, known throughout the Irish neighbourhoods as the Mink for his ability to slip through police cordons and rival gang territories with the fluid grace of a wild predator, possessed the combination of natural charisma and ruthless pragmatism that made him uniquely suited to lead his people in their struggle against both external enemies and internal divisions that threatened to fragment Irish criminal enterprises before they could achieve the unity and discipline necessary for sustained success. The early years of Mickey Sullivan's criminal career were characterized not by the kind of systematic expansion and territorial conquest that marked Italian organized crime, but rather by a series of defensive actions and retaliatory strikes that reflected the Irish community's position as relative newcomers to Gotham's criminal hierarchy, forced to fight for recognition and respect from established organizations that viewed them as unwelcome interlopers, whose presence threatened existing agreements and territorial arrangements that had been negotiated through decades of careful diplomacy and occasional warfare. The reputation for violence that Sullivan and his followers cultivated was born not from inherent brutality, but from strategic necessity, as they understood that their survival depended upon convincing potential enemies that the costs of challenging Irish territorial claims would exceed any possible benefits that might flow from successful conquest. The relationship that developed between the Sullivan family and Carmine Falcone's organization represented one of the most complex and ultimately tragic alliances in Gotham's criminal history, demonstrating how partnerships based upon mutual necessity rather than genuine respect could create obligations and resentments that would eventually destroy both the individual relationships involved and the broader criminal enterprises that depended upon their continued cooperation. The decision to employ Irish gangsters as enforcers and assassins reflected Falcone's understanding that certain types of criminal activities required individuals whose cultural background and psychological makeup made them particularly suited to violent work that more sophisticated Italian criminals preferred to delegate to expendable subordinates whose elimination would not significantly weaken the organization's core capabilities. The assignment that would ultimately destroy the Sullivan family came in the form of a contract to assassinate Harvey Dent and his wife, a mission that represented not merely another criminal enterprise, but a test of Irish loyalty and capability that would determine their future position within Gotham's criminal hierarchy, yet which also placed them in direct opposition to forces and individuals whose power and resources far exceeded anything they had previously encountered in their conflicts with rival ethnic gangs or corrupt law enforcement officials. The magnitude of this assignment should have warned Sullivan that he and his followers were being used as expendable tools in a larger conflict whose true dimensions and dangers had been carefully concealed from them by allies whose primary concern was protecting their own interests rather than ensuring Irish survival and success. The Thanksgiving massacre that claimed the lives of Mickey Sullivan and his entire inner circle represented not merely the elimination of criminal rivals, but the symbolic destruction of Irish dreams of achieving equality and recognition within Gotham's underworld, demonstrating how quickly ethnic solidarity and family loyalty could be transformed into vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through superior intelligence gathering and strategic planning that anticipated and countered traditional Irish methods of ensuring security and maintaining operational secrecy. The holiday killer's systematic targeting of Irish criminals gathered for what should have been a safe family celebration revealed the extent to which their organization had been penetrated and compromised by forces whose identity and motivations remained mysteriously hidden from both the victims and the law enforcement officials who investigated the aftermath of the slaughter. The hotel that became the site of this carnage had been selected by Sullivan as a neutral location where his family could celebrate the American holiday that symbolized their successful adaptation to their adopted country's traditions and values. Yet this same choice reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of their position within Gotham's criminal ecosystem, as they failed to recognize that their enemies viewed every gathering and every moment of relaxation as potential opportunities for coordinated attacks that could eliminate entire leadership structures in single devastating strikes. The irony that Irish criminals were murdered while celebrating a holiday that commemorated the survival of religious refugees in a hostile new world was not lost on those who understood the deeper symbolic dimensions of ethnic conflict in American urban environments. The Riley crime family's approach to organized crime reflected a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate political activity, as Sean Riley recognized that lasting Irish success in Gotham would require not merely the ability to compete with established ethnic organizations through superior violence, but also the development of alliances and partnerships that could provide protection against law enforcement pressure, while creating opportunities for expansion into more profitable and sustainable forms of criminal activity. His vision of Irish-Italian cooperation represented an ambitious attempt to transcend traditional ethnic boundaries and create hybrid organizations whose combined resources and capabilities would be greater than the sum of their individual parts. The arranged marriage between Peyton Riley and Johnny Sabatino was intended to serve as the foundation for this unprecedented alliance. Yet the personal dynamics and cultural conflicts that emerged from this union demonstrated how difficult it was to bridge the gaps between criminal organizations whose methods, values, and long-term objectives had been shaped by entirely different historical experiences and social pressures. The failure of this marriage to produce the hoped-for cooperation between Irish and Italian families revealed the extent to which ethnic identity and cultural tradition remained more powerful forces than rational business considerations in determining the behavior and loyalty of criminal organization members. The domestic violence that characterized Johnny Sabatino's treatment of his Irish wife reflected not merely personal pathology, but broader patterns of ethnic prejudice and cultural superiority that made genuine partnership between Italian and Irish criminals extremely difficult to achieve and maintain, as the very qualities that made each group effective within their own communities became sources of conflict and misunderstanding when they attempted to work together on shared projects and common goals. The Italian emphasis on discipline and hierarchy clashed with Irish traditions of individual autonomy and personal honor, creating tensions that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise, but which ultimately required the kind of violent resolution that destroyed the possibility of future cooperation. Sean Riley's murder by his Italian son-in-law represented not merely the elimination of a criminal rival, but the symbolic rejection of Irish aspirations for equality and partnership within Gotham's criminal hierarchy, demonstrating that established organizations viewed ethnic newcomers not as potential allies but as temporary assets, whose value lay primarily in their willingness to perform dangerous and distasteful tasks that more sophisticated criminals preferred to avoid. The assassination of the Irish patriarch while he was attempting to build bridges between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion and hostility revealed the extent to which ethnic prejudice could override rational business considerations in determining the fate of criminal enterprises. The transformation of Peyton Riley into the ventriloquist represented one of the most psychologically complex and tragic outcomes in the history of organized crime family conflicts, as the young woman's response to the trauma of witnessing her father's murder and experiencing systematic abuse at the hands of her husband manifested itself in the development of multiple personality disorder that allowed her to compartmentalize her pain and rage while creating an alternate identity capable of the kind of ruthless violence that her original personality could never have contemplated or executed. The puppet that became her constant companion served as both psychological coping mechanism and criminal tool, providing her with a method for expressing and acting upon impulses and desires that her conscious mind refused to acknowledge or accept. The criminal enterprise that Peyton Riley built around her psychological condition represented a unique form of organized crime that combined traditional elements of territorial control and protection rackets with innovative methods of intimidation and violence that reflected her fractured mental state and her need to maintain the illusion that her criminal activities were being directed by external forces rather than arising from her own conscious decisions and moral choices. The success of her organization demonstrated that effective criminal leadership could emerge from the most unlikely sources and that psychological trauma, properly channeled, could become a source of strategic advantage in environments where unpredictability and apparent madness could serve as forms of protection against enemies who relied upon rational analysis and conventional strategic thinking. The relationship between the Riley family's criminal activities and the broader Irish community in Gotham represented one of the most complex and morally ambiguous aspects of ethnic organized crime, as traditional Irish cultural values of family loyalty and resistance to authority created both support for criminal enterprises that claimed to represent community interests and opposition to activities that brought unwanted attention. Harassment from law enforcement officials, whose prejudices against Irish immigrants were reinforced by their association with criminal activities. The tension between ethnic pride and criminal reputation created internal conflicts within Irish neighborhoods that were never fully resolved, as community leaders struggled to distance themselves from illegal activities while also defending their cultural heritage against stereotypes and discrimination. The decline and ultimate destruction of Irish criminal power in Gotham reflected broader demographic and economic changes that affected all immigrant communities as they gradually achieved greater integration into American society and found legitimate opportunities for advancement that reduced their dependence upon criminal enterprises for economic survival and social mobility. The younger generation of Irish Americans who possessed better education and greater access to legitimate employment opportunities showed less interest in maintaining the traditional criminal organizations that had served their parents, grandparents as vehicles for resistance against discrimination and poverty, leading to organizational weakness and vulnerability that rival groups could exploit. The legacy of Irish criminal families in Gotham extended far beyond their immediate impact upon the city's underworld to encompass broader questions about the relationship between ethnic identity and criminal behavior, the role of discrimination and poverty in creating conditions that fostered organized crime, and the possibility of redemption and transformation for communities whose criminal reputation had been earned through decades of violence and illegal activity. The stories of families like the Sullivans and Rileys served as cautionary tales about the dangers of allowing legitimate grievances against social injustice to evolve into criminal enterprises that ultimately harmed the very communities they claimed to protect and represent. The cultural traditions and values that Irish criminal families brought to Gotham's underworld included not only methods of organization and approaches to violence, but also concepts of honor and loyalty that would continue to influence criminal behavior long after the original ethnic Organizations had disappeared or been absorbed by more successful rivals. The Irish emphasis on personal courage and willingness to die rather than submit to authority provided inspiration for subsequent generations of criminals, whose ethnic backgrounds were entirely different, yet who recognized the practical advantages of maintaining reputation for fearlessness and commitment to principles that transcended immediate self-interest. The music and stories that celebrated Irish criminal exploits became part of Gotham's broader cultural heritage, influencing popular perceptions of organized crime, while also providing moral frameworks for understanding the relationship between criminal activity and social resistance that would continue to shape public attitudes toward law, enforcement, and criminal justice long after the original historical circumstances that had created Irish criminal enterprises had been transformed by social and economic progress. The ballads that romanticized Irish outlaws and rebels served as vehicles for preserving cultural memory, while also creating mythologies that could inspire future generations of criminals whose personal circumstances bore little resemblance to those of their celebrated predecessors. The neighborhoods that had served as strongholds for Irish criminal families gradually evolved into more diverse communities where multiple ethnic groups competed for territory and influence. Yet the physical infrastructure and social networks that had been created by Irish criminals continued to shape patterns of criminal activity and community organization long after the original ethnic character of these areas had been transformed by demographic changes and urban development. The churches, schools, and social clubs that had provided cover and support for criminal enterprises became legitimate community institutions that served new populations while maintaining connections to criminal traditions that were never entirely eliminated or forgotten. The law enforcement strategies that had been developed specifically to combat Irish criminal organizations influenced police methods and investigative techniques that would be applied against subsequent forms of organized crime, creating institutional knowledge and procedural approaches that reflected both the successes and failures of efforts to suppress ethnic criminal enterprises through traditional law enforcement methods. The recognition that Irish criminals operated according to cultural codes and value systems that were fundamentally different from those that governed other ethnic groups led to the development of specialized approaches to intelligence, gathering, and community relations that acknowledged the importance of understanding cultural context in developing effective crime prevention and prosecution strategies. The political impact of Irish criminal activity upon Gotham's electoral processes and governmental institutions created lasting changes in the relationship between ethnic communities and official authority, as the association between Irish identity and criminal behavior influenced voting patterns, candidate selection, and policy priorities in ways that affected not only law enforcement approaches, but also broader questions of urban governance and social service delivery. The stereotype of Irish criminality became a political liability that legitimate Irish American politicians and community leaders struggled to overcome, while also attempting to maintain their cultural identity and community connections. The economic consequences of Irish criminal enterprises extended beyond the immediate profits generated by illegal activities to encompass broader effects upon neighborhood development, property values, and business investment patterns that influence the long-term prosperity and stability of Irish American communities throughout the city, creating complex relationships between criminal activity and community welfare that could not be easily understood or addressed through simple moral categories or straightforward policy prescriptions. The protection that Irish criminals provided to their neighborhoods against outside threats had to be weighed against the damage that their activities inflicted upon community reputation and economic opportunities. The international connections that linked Irish criminal families in Gotham to organizations and movements in Ireland itself created political complications and security concerns that extended far beyond local criminal justice issues to encompass questions of immigration policy, foreign relations, and domestic terrorism that would become increasingly relevant as global communication and transportation networks made it easier for criminal organizations to operate across national boundaries and coordinate activities between distant locations. The flow of money and weapons between Irish American criminals and Irish Republican organizations created federal law enforcement concerns that brought additional pressure to bear upon local ethnic criminal enterprises. The ultimate fate of Irish criminal families in Gotham served as both cautionary tale and inspiration for subsequent generations of immigrants who faced similar challenges of discrimination and limited opportunity in their attempts to achieve economic success and social recognition in American urban environments, demonstrating that criminal enterprise, while potentially offering short-term solutions to immediate problems, inevitably created new difficulties and dangers that could destroy not only individual families, but entire communities whose reputation and prospects were damaged by association with illegal activities and violent behavior. In the end, the emerald dreams that had brought Irish families to America's shores proved incompatible with the criminal methods they adopted to protect and advance their interests in a hostile urban environment, leaving behind stories of courage and loyalty that were forever tainted by violence and betrayal, creating cultural memories that would continue to influence Irish American identity while serving as reminders of roads not taken and possibilities that had been destroyed through choices that seemed necessary at the time, yet whose consequences extended far beyond anything their makers could have anticipated or understood. From the mist-shrouded harbors where ships bearing flags of distant empires deposited their human cargo upon American shores, where ancient feuds and old-world grudges took root in New World soil like poisonous seeds that would bloom into gardens of violence and betrayal, there emerged criminal dynasties whose very existence challenged the melting pot mythology that promised transformation and redemption for all who crossed the Atlantic in search of better lives. These were the European exiles and Eastern Shadows, organizations whose approach to criminal enterprise bore the distinctive marks of their origins in lands where survival had required centuries of resistance against foreign occupation, where justice was a luxury that only the strong could afford, and where the concept of legitimate authority had been forever corrupted by generations of rulers whose power rested upon nothing more substantial than superior violence and the willingness to employ it without restraint or moral consideration. The web of corruption that connected seemingly respectable businessmen to the darkest corners of Gotham's underworld found its most tragic expression in the relationship between the Wayne family and Lou Moxon, a connection that would ultimately demonstrate how even the most noble and philanthropic members of society could become entangled with criminal enterprises when circumstances demanded pragmatic solutions to problems that legal institutions were powerless to address, creating moral complexities that would haunt subsequent generations and transform personal tragedies into mythologies that shaped the very foundation of heroism and justice in a city where the line between salvation and damnation had always been measured in the thickness of shadows and the weight of choices made in moments when principles collided with necessities too urgent to permit careful consideration of their ultimate consequences. Lou Moxon's criminal empire represented a unique synthesis of legitimate business acumen and illegal enterprise that reflected both the opportunities and limitations available to European immigrants whose cultural backgrounds and professional skills equipped them for success in certain sectors of American commerce, while simultaneously marking them as outsiders whose acceptance into respectable society would always remain conditional upon their willingness to serve interests that were larger and more powerful than their own individual ambitions. The transportation business that provided cover for Moxon's criminal activities was built upon real expertise and genuine innovation in logistics and organizational management. Yet these same capabilities that could have contributed to legitimate economic development were perverted into instruments for activities that undermined the very social order that made business success possible. The friendship that developed between Lou Moxon and Thomas Wayne represented more than simply a relationship between two successful businessmen, but rather a complex alliance that bridged the gap between legitimate society and the criminal underworld in ways that benefited both parties, while also creating vulnerabilities and obligations that neither man fully understood at the time their association was formed. The medical services that Dr. Wayne provided to Moxon during a moment of crisis created bonds of gratitude and mutual dependence that transcended simple professional relationships, demonstrating how acts of compassion and professional duty could create connections that endured long after their immediate circumstances had been forgotten by everyone, except those whose lives had been most directly affected. The decision to employ Joe Chill for the assassination of Thomas and Martha Wayne represented not merely another criminal contract, but a fundamental violation of the unwritten codes that governed relationships between organized crime, respectable society, destroying assumptions about boundaries and limitations that had allowed both criminal enterprises and legitimate institutions to coexist within the same urban environment, despite their fundamental incompatibility and mutual hostility. The murder of the Wayne family marked the crossing of lines that even the most ruthless criminals had previously respected, transforming what should have remained a business relationship into a personal tragedy whose consequences would reverberate through Gotham's history for generations. The psychological transformation of young Bruce Wayne from innocent child into the Dark Knight was directly facilitated by Moxon's decision to eliminate his parents, creating not only a personal motivation for vigilante justice, but also a living symbol of the ways in which criminal activity ultimately consumed the very society it claimed to serve, demonstrating that organized crime was never simply a matter of providing illegal goods and services to willing customers, but rather a form of social cancer that metastasized throughout the community until it destroyed the institutions and relationships that made civilized life possible. The creation of Batman represented both revenge and redemption, the transformation of personal tragedy into a force for justice that would ultimately prove more effective than any legal institution in combating the criminal enterprises that had flourished in Gotham's shadows. The Romanian Ibanescu family's establishment of their criminal empire in Gotham's East End represented a different form of European criminal transplantation, one that brought to American shores not the sophisticated business methods and political connections that characterized Italian organized crime, but rather the brutal survival instincts and predatory behaviors that had been honed through generations of existence in environments where official authority was either absent or actively hostile to the interests of ordinary citizens. The underground tunnels that served as their base of operations provided not only security from law enforcement interference, but also symbolic representation of their relationship to the broader community, as they literally operated beneath the surface of legitimate society, while feeding upon its weaknesses and vulnerabilities like parasites that drew sustenance from their host, while contributing nothing to its health or prosperity. The animal blood sports that provided both entertainment and revenue for the Ibanescu organization represented a form of criminal enterprise that appealed to the most primitive and destructive impulses within human nature, creating spectacles of violence and cruelty that served no purpose beyond the temporary satisfaction of audiences whose own moral development had been stunted by exposure to forms of brutality that gradually eroded their capacity for empathy and compassion. The dogfights and other blood sports that flourished under Ibanescu protection were not merely illegal gambling operations, but rather symptoms of broader social pathology that transformed entertainment into degradation and community gatherings into celebrations of violence that poisoned the cultural environment for everyone who was exposed to their influence. The human trafficking operations that formed the economic foundation of the Ibanescu Empire represented perhaps the most morally reprehensible form of criminal enterprise, reducing human beings to commodities that could be bought and sold like any other form of merchandise, destroying lives and families while generating profits that were used to corrupt law enforcement officials and political authorities whose cooperation was essential for maintaining the networks of transportation and document fraud that made such activities possible on any significant scale. The women and children who became victims of these operations were transformed from individuals with their own hopes and dreams into products whose value was determined entirely by their utility to customers, whose appetites and desires recognized no moral boundaries or legal constraints. Dragos Ibanescu's leadership of his family's criminal enterprises reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of organizational structures that were built around personal charisma and traditional authority rather than institutional relationships and professional competence, creating systems that could be extremely effective in achieving short-term objectives yet which remained vulnerable to disruption through the elimination or corruption of key individuals whose removal would leave their subordinates without the guidance or legitimacy necessary for maintaining operational effectiveness. The patriarchal nature of Romanian criminal culture provided strong internal loyalty and discipline while also creating inflexibilities that made adaptation to changing circumstances difficult and potentially catastrophic when external pressures required rapid organizational evolution. The prostitution networks that supplemented the Ibanescu family's income from other criminal activities represented another form of human exploitation that degraded not only the immediate victims who were forced into sexual slavery, but also the broader community whose moral fabric was weakened by the normalization of commercial sexual exploitation and the corruption of law enforcement and political officials who were bribed to ignore activities that violated both legal statutes and basic human dignity. The brothels and escort services that operated under Ibanescu protection created zones of moral decay that infected surrounding neighborhoods and contributed to the general atmosphere of lawlessness and social breakdown that characterized areas where organized crime had established significant influence. The expansion of Russian organized crime into Gotham represented a different form of Eastern European criminal transplantation, one that brought to American shores not the primitive brutality of Romanian blood sports, but rather the sophisticated methods of political corruption and economic manipulation that had been developed during decades of existence under communist systems where official ideology and actual practice were separated by chasms so vast that survival required the development of alternative economies and shadow governments that operated according to entirely different rules and priorities. The Odessa mob's approach to criminal enterprise reflected their understanding that lasting power in modern urban environments required not merely the ability to commit acts of violence, but also the capacity to manipulate legal and financial institutions in ways that made their activities appear legitimate to casual observers, while remaining profitable and secure from official interference. Vasily Kosov's leadership of the Russian criminal organization demonstrated the effectiveness of applying Eastern European methods of political and economic manipulation to American urban environments, where the complexity of legal and regulatory systems created numerous opportunities for criminal enterprises that possessed sufficient sophistication and patience to exploit bureaucratic weaknesses and institutional blind spots that law enforcement agencies had never been adequately prepared to address. The money laundering operations and financial fraud schemes that provided the foundation for Russian criminal wealth required forms of expertise and technological capability that were far more advanced than the street-level violence and territorial control that characterized traditional forms of organized crime. Alexandra Kosov's role within the Russian organization reflected changing patterns of gender and authority within criminal enterprises, as they adapted to modern social and economic conditions that offered opportunities for women whose intelligence and organizational skills could contribute to criminal success in ways that had never been possible when organized crime was limited to activities that required primarily physical strength and willingness to engage in direct, violent confrontation. Her involvement in human trafficking operations demonstrated both the potential for criminal organizations to transcend traditional gender roles and the tragic reality that such progress often came at the expense of other women whose exploitation and degradation provided the economic foundation for these evolutionary changes in criminal culture. The alliance between the Odessa mob and other criminal organizations represented an attempt to create international networks of cooperation and mutual support that could transcend traditional ethnic and territorial boundaries, while maintaining the cultural identities and operational methods that had made individual groups successful within their own communities and regions. The partnerships that developed between Russian criminals and their American counterparts demonstrated both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of such collaboration, as cultural differences and competing priorities created tensions that could erupt into open warfare when circumstances placed different groups' interests in direct conflict. The conflict between the Odessa mob and the Hill Gang represented a collision between two fundamentally different approaches to criminal enterprise, as the Russians' emphasis on financial manipulation and political corruption encountered the more direct and territorially focused methods that characterized African American criminal organizations whose development had been shaped by different historical experiences and social pressures. The defeat of the Russian organization by enemies, whose methods they had underestimated, demonstrated that technological sophistication and political connections could not always compensate for weaknesses in areas that required more traditional forms of criminal capability. The rise of Onyx as leader of the Hill Gang and her victory over the Odessa mob represented not merely a change in criminal leadership, but a symbolic triumph of indigenous American criminal culture over foreign influence and external control, demonstrating that successful criminal enterprises ultimately required deep understanding of local conditions and community relationships that could not be acquired through purely technical expertise or imported from other cultural contexts. The humiliation of Alexandra Kosov by an opponent who possessed neither her education nor her resources revealed the limitations of approaches to criminal enterprise that relied too heavily upon assumed superiority and insufficient respect for local capabilities and determination. The absorption of surviving Russian criminal assets by Tobias Whale's organization represented a pattern that would be repeated throughout Gotham's criminal history, as successful criminal leaders demonstrated their ability to incorporate useful elements from defeated rivals while eliminating aspects of their operations that were incompatible with existing organizational culture and strategic objectives. The process of criminal succession and consolidation that followed the Russian defeat illustrated both the adaptability and ruthlessness that characterized successful organized crime leadership in environments where survival required constant vigilance against both external enemies and internal threats to established authority. The ultimate failure of European exile organizations to establish lasting influence within Gotham's criminal hierarchy reflected not merely their individual weaknesses or strategic errors, but broader patterns of urban development and demographic change that gradually reduced the isolation and cultural distinctiveness of immigrant communities, while increasing their integration into American social and economic systems that offered legitimate alternatives to criminal enterprise for those willing and able to pursue conventional paths to success and social mobility. The neighborhoods that had provided secure bases for ethnic criminal organizations gradually evolved into more diverse communities where traditional forms of cultural solidarity could no longer provide adequate protection against law, enforcement pressure, or competition from rival groups. The law enforcement strategies that were developed to combat European criminal organizations influenced subsequent approaches to international organized crime investigation and prosecution, creating institutional knowledge and procedural frameworks that would prove valuable in addressing later waves of criminal immigration and the increasing globalization of criminal enterprise that characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The recognition that foreign criminal organizations operated according to cultural codes and organizational methods that were fundamentally different from traditional American forms of organized crime led to the development of specialized investigative techniques and international cooperation, agreements that acknowledged the transnational nature of modern criminal enterprise. The cultural impact of European criminal organizations upon Gotham's broader criminal culture extended far beyond their immediate operational activities to encompass the introduction of new methods of violence, new forms of corruption, and new concepts of criminal organization that would continue to influence criminal behavior long after the original ethnic groups had lost their distinctive character or been absorbed into larger and more successful criminal enterprises. The techniques of political manipulation and financial fraud that had been pioneered by Russian criminals became part of the general toolkit available to all sophisticated criminal organizations, while the brutal methods employed by Romanian traffickers influenced approaches to intimidation and control throughout the underworld. The neighborhoods that had served as strongholds for European criminal families retained traces of their criminal heritage long after the original organizations had disappeared, as the physical infrastructure and social networks that had been created to support illegal activities continued to influence patterns of community development and criminal opportunity in ways that were often invisible to casual observers, yet which remained significant factors in determining the success or failure of subsequent criminal enterprises that attempted to establish themselves in these areas. The legacy of corruption and violence that had been embedded in these communities created ongoing challenges for legitimate residents and business owners who struggled to overcome reputations and associations that had been established by previous generations of criminals. The international connections that had linked European criminal families in Gotham to organizations and networks in their countries of origin created ongoing security concerns and intelligence challenges that extended far beyond local criminal justice issues to encompass questions of immigration, policy, border security, and international terrorism that would become increasingly relevant as global communication and transportation networks made it easier for criminal organizations to operate across national boundaries and coordinate activities between distant locations. The flow of money, weapons, and personnel between American criminal enterprises and their European counterparts created federal law enforcement concerns that brought additional pressure to bear upon local ethnic criminal organizations. The transformation of Gotham's East End from a collection of distinct ethnic neighborhoods into a more integrated and diverse community reflected broader patterns of urban development and social change that affected all American cities during the 20th century as transportation improvements, economic opportunities, and changing immigration patterns gradually broke down the isolation and cultural distinctiveness that had previously characterized immigrant communities, while creating new forms of social organization and identity that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The decline of European criminal influence was both cause and effect of these broader social changes, as criminal organizations lost the community support and cultural protection that had previously shielded them from law enforcement pressure, while also contributing to the breakdown of traditional social structures through their corrupting influence on community institutions and values. In the end, the European exiles and Eastern shadows that had sought to transplant old-world criminal methods to New World opportunities discovered that success in American criminal enterprise required not merely the transplantation of traditional techniques and organizational structures, but also the development of new capabilities and relationships that could bridge the gap between immigrant communities and the broader American society, whose resources and opportunities they sought to exploit, creating hybrid forms of criminal organization that preserved certain elements of their cultural heritage while adapting to local conditions and requirements that had no equivalent in their countries of origin, leaving behind legacies that would continue to influence Gotham's criminal landscape long after the original ethnic identities and cultural distinctions that had created them had been transformed beyond recognition by the relentless processes of American social and economic integration. From the ancient ports where monsoon winds carried secrets across jade seas, and where dynasties rose and fell with the rhythm of tides that had witnessed centuries of conquest and rebellion, where honor was measured not in gold but in the willingness to die for principles that outsiders could never comprehend, there emerged in Gotham's ethnic enclaves criminal organizations whose codes of conduct and methods of operation bore the distinctive marks of civilizations that had perfected the arts of war, diplomacy, and vengeance through millennia of survival in environments where weakness meant extinction and strength required not merely physical prowess, but mastery of psychological warfare and strategic patience that could span generations. These were the Asian underworld families, organizations whose approach to criminal enterprise reflected not the improvised brutality of European exiles or the passionate intensity of Celtic rebels, but rather the refined sophistication of cultures that had developed their criminal traditions alongside legitimate arts of governance, philosophy, and military science, creating hybrid forms of illegal enterprise that combined ancient wisdom with modern opportunity in ways that made them uniquely dangerous to enemies who underestimated the depth of their strategic thinking and the completeness of their commitment to principles that transcended individual life and immediate profit. The Yakuza presence in Gotham represented the transplantation of one of history's most sophisticated and enduring criminal cultures to American soil, bringing with it not merely techniques of organization and methods of violence, but entire philosophical frameworks that governed the relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate society, between individual ambition and collective obligation, between honor earned through service and respect demanded through fear. The Japanese concept of criminal organization as a shadow government that provided services and maintained order in areas where official authority was either absent or inadequate, created forms of illegal enterprise that served paradoxical functions within the broader community, simultaneously preying upon legitimate businesses while also protecting them from less disciplined forms of criminal activity that might have proven far more destructive to social stability and economic development. Akihara's leadership of the Gotham Yakuza reflected both the strengths and limitations of traditional Japanese approaches to criminal authority, as his commitment to maintaining proper relationships and observing correct procedures enabled him to build alliances and command respect within the city's complex criminal hierarchy, while also creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through attacks that violated the unwritten rules and ceremonial protocols that governed honorable criminal behavior. The code of Bushido that influenced Yakuza methodology emphasized courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice in ways that made individual members formidable opponents, yet which also created predictable patterns of behavior that sophisticated enemies could anticipate and counter through strategies that abandoned honor in favor of effectiveness. The territorial agreements that the Yakuza negotiated with other ethnic criminal organizations demonstrated their understanding that lasting success in American urban environments required forms of cooperation and diplomatic compromise that might have been unnecessary in traditional Japanese society, where cultural homogeneity and historical precedent provided clearer guidelines for resolving conflicts and maintaining social order. The precision with which boundaries were drawn and responsibilities allocated reflected centuries of experience in managing complex relationships between competing centers of power, yet also revealed the extent to which foreign criminal organizations remained dependent upon the continued cooperation of indigenous groups whose priorities and methods had been shaped by entirely different historical experiences. The assassination of Akihara during the gang war that swept through Gotham's underworld represented not merely the elimination of a criminal leader, but the destruction of a stabilizing force that had helped maintain peace between organizations whose natural tendency toward territorial expansion and resource competition might otherwise have erupted into the kind of open warfare that would have attracted unwanted federal attention, while also disrupting the illegal economies that provided income and employment for thousands of individuals whose survival depended upon the continued functioning of criminal enterprises. His death created a power vacuum that could not be filled by subordinates who lacked both his personal authority and his deep understanding of the cultural factors that influenced criminal behavior within immigrant communities. The emergence of King Snake as a dominant force in Asian criminal enterprise represented a fundamental shift away from traditional Japanese concepts of honor and collective responsibility toward more aggressive and individualistic approaches to criminal leadership that reflected the influence of Chinese criminal culture and the practical requirements of operating in international markets where success depended more upon adaptability and ruthlessness than upon adherence to ancient codes of conduct that had been developed for entirely different social and economic conditions. The heroin empire that King Snake constructed demonstrated both the enormous profits available to criminal organizations that could successfully navigate global drug markets and the corrupting influence of narcotics trafficking upon traditional criminal culture. The Ghost Dragons organization that operated under King Snake's authority represented a new form of Asian criminal enterprise that combined traditional elements of Chinese secret society organization with modern techniques of international drug trafficking and money laundering, creating hybrid structures that were simultaneously more flexible and more dangerous than purely traditional criminal organizations, while also being less stable and predictable due to their emphasis on profit maximization rather than cultural preservation and community service. The recruitment methods that brought young immigrants into the organization reflected both the opportunities and vulnerabilities created by rapid economic development in Asian immigrant communities. Billy Hugh's leadership of the Ghost Dragon's street operations demonstrated both the potential for rapid advancement within criminal organizations that prioritized results over traditional qualifications and the ultimate fragility of authority that was based primarily upon personal capability, rather than cultural legitimacy and community support, as his execution by King Snake for failure to eliminate American law enforcement interference revealed the extent to which modern Asian criminal enterprises had abandoned traditional concepts of loyalty and mutual obligation in favor of purely transactional relationships that could be terminated without ceremony when they no longer served the organization's immediate interests. The relationship between Billy Hugh and Lynx represented one of the most complex and tragic aspects of modern Asian criminal culture, as their romantic involvement became entangled with criminal obligations and organizational hierarchies in ways that ultimately destroyed both their personal happiness and their professional effectiveness, demonstrating how the modernization of criminal enterprise often came at the cost of human relationships and emotional stability that had previously been protected by traditional codes of conduct that recognized the importance of maintaining boundaries between business and personal life. The punishment that Lynx received for her failure to defeat American law enforcement operatives served as a brutal reminder that gender equality within criminal organizations often meant equal exposure to violence and degradation, rather than equal access to power and respect. Lynx's eventual rise to leadership of the Ghost Dragons through the murder of King Snake represented both a form of justice and a continuation of the cycle of violence that had characterized the organization since its abandonment of traditional Chinese criminal culture in favor of purely profit-driven enterprise. As her revenge against the man who had destroyed her relationship and mutilated her body demonstrated that modern criminal organizations remained vulnerable to the same personal grudges and emotional motivations that had always influenced human behavior, despite their claims to operate according to purely rational business principles. Her assumption of control over the heroin trafficking networks revealed both her organizational capabilities and the extent to which criminal leadership had become divorced from traditional concepts of cultural authority and community responsibility. The territorial expansion that Lynx attempted to achieve through her leadership of the Ghost Dragons brought her into conflict with other criminal organizations whose own growth ambitions created inevitable clashes over resources and markets that could not be resolved through traditional diplomatic methods or cultural appeals to shared values and mutual respect, forcing her to employ increasingly violent tactics that ultimately attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies and vigilante crime fighters, whose intervention capabilities exceeded those available to traditional forms of criminal authority. The failure of her expansion efforts demonstrated that even the most capable individual leaders could not overcome the structural disadvantages that small ethnic criminal organizations faced when competing against larger and more established rivals. The accidental death of Lynx during combat with her own subordinates represented both the ultimate irony of criminal leadership and a symbolic conclusion to the experiment in modernized Asian criminal enterprise that had begun with King Snake's rejection of traditional Japanese and Chinese approaches to organized crime in favor of international drug trafficking and profit maximization, without regard for cultural values or community obligations. Her beheading by a gang member who was presumably loyal to her leadership revealed the extent to which violence had become so normalized within modern criminal organizations that it could erupt spontaneously, even between allies, making stable leadership and long-term planning increasingly difficult to achieve and maintain. The Golden Dragons organization that emerged as successors to the Ghost Dragons represented an attempt to restore traditional Chinese criminal culture within Gotham's Asian underworld. Yet their operations during the No Man's Land crisis demonstrated that even organizations committed to preserving cultural traditions could be forced to adapt their methods and objectives to address immediate survival requirements that had no precedent in historical experience, creating hybrid approaches to criminal enterprise that combined ancient wisdom with contemporary necessity in ways that satisfied neither traditionalists nor modernizers within the organization's membership. The territory that they controlled during this period represented both an achievement and a burden, as maintaining order required resources and capabilities that stretched their organizational limits. The Lucky Hand Triad's domination of Gotham's Chinatown represented perhaps the most successful example of traditional Chinese criminal organization adapting to American urban conditions while maintaining cultural authenticity and community support, as their specialization in heroin trafficking was balanced by their provision of services and protection that benefited legitimate businesses and residents within their territorial boundaries, creating symbiotic relationships that enabled them to operate with minimal interference from law enforcement agencies, while also generating sufficient income to support expansion into other criminal markets and geographical areas. Ikinzu's leadership of the organization demonstrated both the effectiveness of traditional Chinese approaches to criminal authority and their ultimate vulnerability to external pressures that could not be addressed through conventional methods. The expansion plans that Ikinzu developed for extending Lucky Hand Triad influence beyond the boundaries of Chinatown reflected both legitimate ambition for organizational growth and dangerous overconfidence in his ability to compete successfully against criminal organizations that possessed superior resources and more extensive political connections, as his failure to anticipate the coordination and intensity of opposition that would emerge from rival groups demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal leaders could be destroyed by their own success when it threatened established power structures that had been carefully constructed over decades of negotiation and conflict. The obliteration of his organization during the gang war revealed both the potential rewards and ultimate risks of criminal expansion in competitive urban environments. The Hanoi 10 organization represented yet another variation in Asian criminal enterprise, bringing Vietnamese cultural traditions and wartime experiences to bear upon American criminal opportunities in ways that combined guerrilla warfare techniques with traditional organized crime methods, creating hybrid approaches to territorial control and resource extraction that reflected their members' backgrounds as refugees from military conflicts where survival had required forms of violence and organizational discipline that exceeded anything demanded by purely criminal enterprises. The territorial disputes that brought them into conflict with Chinese organizations revealed both their capabilities and their limitations as they attempted to establish themselves within ethnic criminal hierarchies that had been dominated by other groups for decades. The evolution of Asian criminal organizations within Gotham's underworld reflected broader patterns of immigration and cultural adaptation that affected all ethnic communities as they struggled to maintain traditional identities while also achieving success within American social and economic systems that rewarded individual achievement over collective solidarity, creating tensions between cultural preservation and practical necessity that were never fully resolved, and which continued to influence criminal behavior long after the original immigrant generation had been replaced by American-born descendants whose relationship to traditional culture was far more complex and ambiguous than that of their parents and grandparents. The heroin trafficking that provided the economic foundation for most Asian criminal enterprises represented both an opportunity and a curse, as the enormous profits available from narcotics distribution enabled these organizations to achieve levels of wealth and influence that would have been impossible through traditional forms of criminal activity, yet also created dependencies upon international suppliers and distribution networks whose priorities and methods often conflicted with traditional cultural values and community obligations, forcing criminal leaders to choose between financial success and cultural authenticity in ways that ultimately weakened their organization's cohesion and moral authority. The violence that characterized competition between Asian criminal organizations reflected not merely business rivalry, but deeper cultural conflicts over the proper relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate society, as traditionalists who believed that criminal organizations should serve protective and stabilizing functions within their communities, clashed with modernizers who prioritized profit maximization and territorial expansion over cultural responsibilities and community welfare, creating internal divisions that enemies could exploit while also contributing to the general breakdown of discipline and loyalty that had previously made these organizations more effective than their competitors. The law enforcement strategies that were developed specifically to combat Asian criminal organizations reflected both the sophistication of these groups and the cultural barriers that made conventional investigative techniques largely ineffective against organizations whose members' loyalty was reinforced by cultural values and personal relationships that transcended immediate self-interest, requiring the development of specialized approaches to intelligence gathering and community outreach that acknowledged the importance of understanding cultural context in developing effective crime prevention and prosecution strategies that could address the root causes of criminal behavior rather than merely suppressing its symptoms. The impact of Asian criminal organizations upon their respective ethnic communities was both more profound and more complex than that of other ethnic criminal enterprises, as the cultural emphasis on collective responsibility and family honor created situations where criminal behavior by individual members reflected upon entire communities, while also generating forms of social pressure and mutual obligation that could either support or constrain criminal activity, depending upon the specific circumstances and the attitudes of community leaders who possessed moral authority that transcended legal or political considerations. The international connections that linked Asian criminal organizations in Gotham to networks and enterprises in their countries of origin created ongoing security concerns and intelligence challenges that reflected the increasing globalization of criminal enterprise and the development of communication and transportation technologies that made coordination between distant locations far easier than had ever been possible in previous eras, requiring law enforcement agencies to develop new capabilities and international cooperation agreements that could address threats that transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries and legal frameworks. The cultural traditions that Asian criminal organizations brought to Gotham's underworld included not only specific techniques and organizational methods, but also philosophical approaches to criminal behavior that emphasized long-term strategic thinking and patient accumulation of power and influence rather than immediate gratification of material desires or emotional impulses, creating forms of criminal enterprise that were simultaneously more stable and more dangerous than organizations that operated according to less disciplined and systematic approaches to illegal activity and territorial control. The neighborhoods that served as strongholds for Asian criminal organizations retained distinctive cultural characteristics that reflected both legitimate community development and the influence of criminal enterprises that had shaped patterns of business ownership, residential development, and social organization in ways that created lasting legacies, extending far beyond the immediate operational activities of specific criminal groups, influencing community life and cultural development for generations. After the original criminal organizations had been eliminated or transformed beyond recognition through law enforcement pressure and demographic change. In the end, the Asian underworld that flourished within Gotham's ethnic enclaves represented both the highest achievements and the ultimate limitations of criminal organizations that attempted to preserve traditional cultural values while adapting to modern criminal opportunities, demonstrating that honor and brutality could coexist within the same organizational frameworks, yet could never be fully reconciled, in ways that satisfied both cultural authenticity and practical effectiveness, leaving behind legacies that would continue to influence criminal behavior and community development long after the original cultural conflicts and generational tensions that had created these organizations had been resolved through the inexorable processes of American social and economic integration that transformed all immigrant communities regardless of their initial resistance to assimilation and cultural change. From the sun-scorched borderlands where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen beneath the weight of conquest and revolution, where the scent of marigolds mingled with the metallic tang of violence, where family loyalty was measured not in words but in blood spilled for honor and survival, there emerged in Gotham's sprawling urban landscape criminal organizations, whose roots stretched deep into the rich soil of Latin American tradition, whose understanding of power and respect had been forged in the crucible of colonial oppression and revolutionary struggle, whose codes of conduct reflected centuries of resistance against foreign domination and internal betrayal. These were the Latin connection families, cartels and gangs whose approach to criminal enterprise bore the distinctive marks of cultures that had survived conquest through adaptability and cunning, that had learned to transform every form of suffering into strength, every defeat into opportunity, for eventual triumph through patience and strategic thinking that could span generations of careful planning and methodical revenge. The Escobedo cartel's establishment of operations within Gotham's Coventry district represented not merely another expansion of South American drug trafficking into North American markets, but rather the sophisticated transplantation of an entire criminal philosophy and organizational methodology that had been perfected through decades of struggle against government forces and rival cartels whose resources and capabilities far exceeded anything available to traditional urban criminal organizations, creating forms of illegal enterprise that combined military discipline with business acumen in ways that made them uniquely effective at generating enormous profits while maintaining operational security against law enforcement agencies that had been trained primarily to combat domestic criminal activities rather than international drug trafficking networks with global reach and unlimited financial resources. Manuel Escobedo's leadership of his family's criminal empire reflected both the opportunities and challenges that confronted South American criminal organizations as they attempted to expand their operations into foreign markets, where cultural differences and established competition required forms of adaptation and strategic thinking that went far beyond simple replication of methods that had proven successful in their countries of origin, demanding new approaches to territorial control, political corruption, and violence that could achieve their objectives, while also respecting local conditions and power structures that had been established through decades of negotiation and conflict among indigenous criminal organizations. His understanding of wholesale drug distribution represented a fundamental evolution in criminal thinking that recognized the greater profitability and reduced risk associated with limiting direct involvement to the highest levels of the criminal thinking distribution chain, while allowing local organizations to handle retail sales and customer contact that carried the greatest exposure to law enforcement surveillance and interdiction efforts. The sophistication of Escobedo's approach to narcotics trafficking was demonstrated through his systematic avoidance of street-level drug distribution activities that had historically provided the foundation for urban criminal enterprises, but which also created the greatest exposure to law enforcement investigation and prosecution. Recognizing that lasting success in international drug trafficking required organizational structures that separated supply operations from retail distribution in ways that protected high-level leadership from the consequences of inevitable law enforcement successes against lower-level operatives whose arrest and prosecution could be absorbed without significant impact upon overall organizational effectiveness. This strategic approach to criminal enterprise represented a fundamental departure from traditional territorial-based criminal organizations that had built their power through direct control over specific geographical areas and the power, criminal activities that occurred within those boundaries. The wholesale nature of Escobedo operations enabled them to generate enormous profits with relatively minimal investment in personnel and infrastructure compared to organizations that attempted to maintain complete vertical integration of their criminal enterprises, from production through retail, distribution. Yet this same strategic advantage also created dependencies upon local criminal organizations whose cooperation was essential for moving drugs from wholesale to retail markets, requiring forms of diplomacy and relationship management that were often more complex and dangerous than direct territorial warfare between competing organizations. The success of wholesale drug trafficking depended entirely upon maintaining positive relationships with multiple retail distribution networks, while also avoiding entanglement in their local conflicts and territorial disputes that could then attract unwanted law enforcement attention. The relationship between the Escobedo cartel and the Burnley Town Massive represented one of the most successful examples of cooperation between international drug suppliers and local distribution networks, demonstrating how cultural and geographical differences between criminal organizations could become sources of strength rather than weakness when properly managed through careful attention to mutual interests and respect for each group's areas of expertise and territorial responsibilities. The arrangement that allowed Escobedo to supply wholesale quantities of narcotics to Burnley Town Massive operations without becoming directly involved in street-level distribution activities provided benefits to both organizations, while also creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through attacks that disrupted the coordination and trust necessary for maintaining successful business relationships. The territorial boundaries that confined Escobedo operations to the Coventry district reflected both strategic choices about operational security and practical limitations, imposed by the need to avoid direct confrontation with established criminal organizations whose territorial claims had been recognized through decades of negotiation and warfare, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated international criminal enterprises remained subject to local power structures and political arrangements that could not be safely ignored or violated without risking the kind of escalating conflict that would ultimately prove more costly than any potential benefits that might be gained through territorial expansion. The discipline required to maintain these boundaries revealed both the organizational maturity of Escobedo leadership and their understanding of the long-term strategic thinking necessary for sustainable criminal success. The gang war that ultimately destroyed the Escobedo cartel's Gotham operations represented not merely a failure of individual leadership or tactical planning, but rather the inevitable result of operating in urban environments where criminal organizations were subject to forms of violence and competition that international drug cartels had never been required to address in their countries of origin, where territorial disputes could escalate into open warfare that attracted law enforcement attention, while also disrupting the relationships and agreements that made wholesale drug trafficking possible. The destruction of Escobedo operations demonstrated both the enormous profits available to successful drug trafficking organizations and the ultimate fragility of criminal enterprises that depended upon maintaining peaceful relationships with multiple independent groups whose own conflicts and ambitions could not be controlled through external influence or diplomatic intervention. The Latino Unified Gang represented an entirely different approach to Latin American criminal organization within Gotham's underworld, attempting to transcend traditional, national, and regional divisions that had historically prevented cooperation between criminal groups whose cultural backgrounds and territorial claims had been shaped by different historical experiences and migration patterns, creating hybrid organizations that combined elements from multiple Latin American criminal traditions, while also adapting to local conditions and opportunities that required new forms of organization and leadership that had no precedent in their countries of origin. The unification effort that brought together numerous smaller Latino gangs under a single organizational structure represented both ambitious strategic thinking and dangerous experimentation with untested approaches to criminal cooperation and collective action. The leadership challenges that confronted the Latino Unified Gang reflected fundamental tensions between traditional approaches to criminal authority that emphasized personal charisma and family connections and modern requirements for organizational effectiveness that demanded professional competence and strategic thinking, regardless of cultural background or personal relationships, creating internal conflicts that were never fully resolved and which ultimately contributed to the organization's vulnerability to external pressure and internal betrayal. The assassination of Otero during the gang meeting that had been intended to strengthen unity and coordination among member organizations revealed both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of attempting to create criminal confederations that transcended traditional ethnic and territorial boundaries. The intervention of Tarantula in the conflict between the Latino Unified Gang and the Hill Gang represented a form of outside mediation that was unprecedented in Gotham's criminal history, demonstrating how individual actors with sufficient capability and moral authority could influence the behavior of criminal organizations through methods that combined elements of negotiation, intimidation, and leadership that transcended traditional categories of law enforcement and criminal activity. Her assumption of control over the Latino Unified Gang created a hybrid form of criminal organization that combined traditional gang structure with vigilante justice principles in ways that challenged conventional understanding of both. criminal enterprise and crime-fighting methodology. The survival of the Latino Unified Gang under Tarantula's leadership through the period of major gang warfare demonstrated both the effectiveness of her approach to criminal organization and the limitations of external intervention in addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that created criminal opportunities and motivated gang membership among populations, whose legitimate options for advancement and economic success remained severely limited by discrimination, educational disadvantages, and structural inequalities that no individual leader could address through changes in criminal organization alone. The success in avoiding destruction during the gang war revealed both tactical sophistication and strategic restraint that enabled the organization to survive conflicts that eliminated many of their competitors and rivals. The trap that Black Mask set for Latino criminal organizations at the Avery Theater represented both the culmination of his campaign to consolidate control over Gotham's underworld and a demonstration of the strategic thinking and organizational capabilities that had made him one of the city's most dangerous and effective criminal leaders, showing how intelligence gathering and psychological manipulation could be combined with superior firepower and tactical planning to eliminate multiple enemy organizations simultaneously, while also sending clear messages to surviving criminal groups about the consequences of continued resistance to his authority. The theatrical setting of this mass assassination attempt reflected both the symbolic dimensions of criminal warfare and the practical advantages of choosing locations that could be easily controlled and defended, while also limiting opportunities for escape or external intervention. The assistance that Batman provided to enable the Latino Unified Gang's escape from Black Mask's trap represented one of the most complex moral decisions in the Dark Knight's career, as his intervention on behalf of criminal organizations challenged traditional concepts of vigilante justice while also serving broader strategic objectives related to preventing the consolidation of criminal power under single leadership that might prove more dangerous than the fragmented and competitive criminal landscape that had previously characterized Gotham's underworld. The decision to help criminals escape from other criminals revealed both the pragmatic flexibility of Batman's approach to crime fighting and the recognition that absolute adherence to simple moral categories was insufficient for addressing the complex realities of urban criminal dynamics. The penitent cartel represented perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous evolution in Latin American criminal enterprise, combining traditional cartel methods of violence and corruption with innovative approaches to population control and addiction creation that went far beyond simple drug distribution to encompass systematic contamination of legitimate food, distribution systems in ways that would create captive markets and guaranteed demand for cartel products, while also demonstrating the organization's capability to reach into every aspect of civilian life and social infrastructure. The mysterious nature of El Penitente's identity and the secretive character of his organization's operations reflected both operational security concerns and the symbolic dimensions of criminal leadership that sought to inspire fear and respect through mystique and unpredictability, rather than through direct displays of wealth and power. The strategy of contaminating Gotham's food supply with addictive chemicals represented a form of criminal enterprise that transcended traditional boundaries between drug trafficking and terrorism, creating situations where entire populations could become dependent upon cartel-supplied substances without their knowledge or consent, transforming ordinary citizens into unwilling participants in criminal enterprises that they had no conscious intention of supporting or enabling. The sophistication required to implement such widespread contamination while avoiding detection by health authorities and food safety inspectors demonstrated both the technical capabilities and financial resources available to international criminal organizations that had evolved far beyond the limitations that constrained traditional urban criminal enterprises. The insidious nature of the penitente strategy lay not only in its potential for creating massive addiction and dependence among civilian populations, but also in its demonstration of how criminal organizations could exploit legitimate social institutions and infrastructure systems to achieve objectives that would have been impossible through traditional methods of territorial control and direct coercion, revealing vulnerabilities in modern urban society that had never been adequately anticipated or protected against by law enforcement agencies, whose training and resources had been developed primarily to address more conventional forms of criminal activity and public safety threats. Jason Todd's intervention against the Penitente cartel represented a form of vigilante action that exceeded even Batman's typical methods in terms of its willingness to employ lethal force and systematic destruction against criminal organizations, demonstrating both the effectiveness of overwhelming violence against enemies whose own capabilities had made them largely immune to traditional law enforcement approaches, and the moral dangers inherent in crime-fighting methods that abandoned restraint and legal process in favor of expedient solutions that achieved immediate tactical objectives, while also creating precedents for future vigilante actions that might prove impossible to control or limit through conventional moral and legal frameworks. The devastation that Todd inflicted upon penitente operations revealed both his tactical capabilities and his willingness to cross lines that more restrained crime fighters had always respected, showing how personal trauma and moral outrage could motivate forms of vigilante justice that were simultaneously more effective and more dangerous than traditional approaches to criminal investigation and prosecution, creating results that served immediate public safety interests, while also raising fundamental questions about the relationship between justice and vengeance in environments where legal institutions had proven inadequate for addressing the most serious threats to public welfare and social order. The broader implications of Latin American criminal influence within Gotham extended far beyond the immediate operational activities of specific cartels and gangs to encompass questions about immigration, cultural identity, and economic opportunity that affected entire communities whose legitimate members found themselves subject to suspicion and discrimination based upon their association with criminal organizations that claimed to represent their interests, while actually exploiting their vulnerabilities and limiting their opportunities for legitimate advancement and social integration. The tension between ethnic pride and criminal reputation created internal conflicts within Latino communities that were never fully resolved and which continued to influence community development and political participation long after the criminality's bygone. Original criminal organizations had been eliminated or transformed through law enforcement pressure and demographic change. The evolution of Latin American criminal organizations within Gotham's underworld reflected broader patterns of globalization and economic development that had transformed traditional criminal enterprises from local territorial organizations into international networks capable of moving money, personnel, and contraband across national boundaries with sophistication that exceeded the capabilities of many legitimate businesses and governmental agencies, requiring new approaches to criminal investigation and prosecution that acknowledged the transnational nature of modern criminal enterprise, while also addressing the local conditions and community relationships that enabled these organizations to establish operational bases and recruit members within specific urban environments. The cultural traditions that Latin American criminal organizations brought to Gotham included not only specific techniques and organizational methods, but also philosophical approaches to criminal behavior that emphasized family, loyalty, personal honor, and collective responsibility in ways that created both strength and vulnerability within criminal enterprises. As the same values that inspired fierce loyalty and personal courage among organization members also created predictable patterns of behavior that skilled opponents could exploit through psychological warfare and targeted attacks against family members and community relationships that provided emotional and logistical support for criminal activities. In the end, the Latin connection that emerged within Gotham's criminal landscape represented both the promise and peril of cultural diversity within criminal enterprises, demonstrating how traditional values and community relationships could be both preserved and corrupted through involvement in illegal activities that provided economic opportunities, while also creating moral contradictions and social tensions that ultimately weakened the very communities that criminal organizations claim to protect and represent, leaving behind legacies of violence and betrayal that would continue to influence community development and cultural identity long after the original criminal enterprises had been forgotten or transformed beyond recognition through the blossomed, inexorable processes of social and economic change. In the shadows that existed before Gotham itself was born, where ancient stones held secrets that predated the first European settlements, where power flowed through channels carved by centuries of careful manipulation and patient cultivation of influence that transcended the ephemeral concerns of individual lifetimes or political administrations, there dwelt organizations whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of authority and the sources of true control within human society. These were the secret societies that had shaped Gotham's destiny from its earliest days, the hidden hands that guided the city's development according to agendas and objectives that remained invisible to those who believed themselves to be the architects of their own fate. The ancient powers whose influence penetrated so deeply into the fabric of legitimate institutions that the distinction between official authority and shadow governance had long since ceased to have meaningful relevance for those who understood the true mechanisms through which power was exercised and maintained across generations of careful planning and methodical execution. The Court of Owls represented perhaps the most perfect expression of aristocratic criminal enterprise ever conceived, an organization that had transformed the natural advantages of wealth and social position into instruments of control, so sophisticated and comprehensive that their influence extended into every aspect of Gotham's development, from the architectural blueprints that determined the physical structure of the city to the genealogical networks that shaped the social relationships among its most prominent families, creating systems of power that operated with such subtlety and effectiveness that even their victims rarely understood the true nature of the forces that controlled their destinies. The nursery rhyme that preserved their legend in popular culture served simultaneously as warning and concealment, ensuring that knowledge of their existence would survive across generations, while also reducing that knowledge to the level of folklore and superstition that serious adults could dismiss as childish fantasy, rather than recognizing as historical truth disguised in metaphorical language. The origins of the court stretched back through centuries of Gotham's history to the earliest days of colonial settlement, when the families who would become the city's founding dynasties recognized that lasting power required not merely temporary political advantage or immediate economic success, but rather the creation of institutional structures that could preserve and protect their interests across multiple generations, regardless of changes in public opinion, governmental policies, or economic conditions that might threaten the position of individual families while leaving the collective influence of the aristocratic class intact and unchallenged. The vision that guided the court's formation was breathtaking in its scope and ambition, seeking nothing less than the complete subordination of democratic institutions and popular will to the enlightened guidance of those whose breeding, education, and inherited wisdom qualified them to make decisions for the common good that ordinary citizens could never understand or appreciate. The architectural integration of court influence into Gotham's physical structure represented one of their most brilliant and far-sighted strategic innovations, ensuring that their power would be literally built into the foundations of the city in ways that could never be completely eliminated or overcome by future generations who might seek to challenge their authority through conventional, political, or legal means. The hidden passages and secret chambers that honeycombed the buildings and infrastructure of downtown Gotham provided not merely convenient meeting places and secure communication networks, but also symbolic representations of the invisible influence that the court exercised over every aspect of urban life, creating a shadow city that existed parallel to and within the official municipal structure, while remaining forever hidden from those who lacked the knowledge and access necessary to perceive its existence. The selection and training of talons represented the court's most sophisticated achievement in the arts of human manipulation and behavioral conditioning, transforming children who should have grown into heroes and protectors of the innocent into perfect instruments of assassination and intimidation, whose loyalty to their masters had been so completely internalized that they could never conceive of questioning or resisting orders that required them to murder the very people they had originally been trained to serve and protect. The process that created these living weapons began with the identification of candidates whose natural abilities and psychological profiles made them suitable for development into ultimate expressions of human physical and mental capability, yet who also possessed vulnerabilities and dependencies that could be exploited to ensure their permanent subordination to court authority. The relationship between the court and Haley's circus represented one of the most insidious examples of their ability to corrupt institutions that appeared to serve entirely legitimate and beneficial purposes, transforming what should have been sources of joy and wonder for children into recruitment centers for an assassination program that violated every principle of human decency and child protection, while maintaining the facade of wholesome family entertainment that concealed its true purpose from parents who entrusted their children's safety to performers and administrators whose primary loyalty was to masters, whose identity and objectives remained forever hidden from public scrutiny. The acrobatic skills that made circus performers so entertaining to audiences also made them uniquely valuable as assassins, whose physical capabilities exceeded those available through conventional military or police training programs. The near recruitment of Dick Grayson as a Talon represented both the greatest success and ultimate failure of the court's selection and training program, demonstrating both their ability to identify and cultivate perfect candidates for their assassination corps, and their vulnerability to interference from individuals whose moral authority and personal dedication could disrupt their carefully planned operations through acts of compassion and protective intervention that had never been adequately anticipated or prepared for by organizations whose understanding of human behavior was based entirely upon manipulation and coercion, rather than genuine love and selfless service. Bruce Wayne's adoption of the young acrobat represented not merely personal kindness, but a fundamental challenge to the court's assumptions about human nature and the inevitability of their control over individuals whose circumstances made them appear to be perfect targets for recruitment and exploitation. The centuries-long manipulation of Gotham's political and economic development by the court created distortions and inefficiencies that affected every aspect of urban life, from transportation systems that served the convenience of secret networks rather than public needs, to zoning regulations that protected aristocratic interests, while limiting opportunities for working-class advancement and social mobility, demonstrating how seemingly neutral and technical governmental decisions could be shaped by hidden influences in ways that perpetuated existing inequalities, while appearing to serve the common good through rational planning and expert administration. The cumulative effect of these manipulations was the creation of an urban environment that served the court's interests so perfectly that their continued dominance appeared to be the natural and inevitable result of superior capability rather than the artificial product of systematic corruption and behind-the-scenes interference with democratic processes. The League of Assassins represented a very different form of secret society organization, one that rejected the court's emphasis on preserving existing social structures in favor of radical transformation, that would eliminate the environmental destruction and social corruption that, in their analysis, had made traditional forms of civilization unsustainable and incompatible with long-term human survival on a planet whose resources and ecological balance had been damaged beyond repair by industrial development and population growth, that prioritized short-term economic gain over environmental stewardship and intergenerational responsibility. The League's commitment to environmental extremism reflected not mere political ideology but philosophical conviction that human civilization had reached a point where incremental reform was insufficient to address existential threats that required immediate and dramatic action regardless of the human cost involved in implementing solutions that might appear harsh, yet were ultimately necessary for species survival. Ra's al Ghul's leadership of the League demonstrated both the seductive appeal of absolutist solutions to complex social problems and the ultimate corruption that inevitably affected individuals who assumed the right to make life and death decisions for entire populations based upon their own understanding of historical necessity and ecological imperative, showing how even the most noble and far-sighted objectives could become justifications for mass murder when they were pursued by organizations that recognized no moral authority higher than their own analysis of global conditions and long-term survival requirements. His longevity and accumulated wisdom made him uniquely qualified to perceive patterns and trends that escaped the attention of individuals whose perspective was limited by normal human lifespans. Yet these same advantages also isolated him from the immediate human concerns and emotional connections that provided moral guidance for leaders, whose authority was checked by accountability to constituents, whose welfare they were obligated to protect and promote. The global reach of the League's operations reflected both the international scope of the environmental problems they sought to address and the megalomaniacal character of their proposed solutions, as their willingness to employ assassination and terrorism in pursuit of ecological balance demonstrated the extent to which extremist ideology could corrupt even legitimate concerns about planetary welfare and intergenerational justice, transforming rational environmental advocacy into fanatical crusade that viewed human beings as obstacles to be eliminated rather than communities to be served and protected through sustainable development and democratic decision-making that acknowledged both environmental constraints and human dignity. The League's environmental mission provided moral justification for activities that would otherwise be recognized as simple terrorism and mass murder, demonstrating how noble objectives could become vehicles for the expression of misanthropic hatred and contempt for human weakness and moral limitation. The recruitment methods that the League employed to build their international network of operatives reflected both their understanding of the psychological profiles that made individuals susceptible to extremist ideology and their willingness to exploit personal tragedy and social alienation in pursuit of organizational objectives that required absolute dedication and unquestioning obedience to leadership whose authority was based upon claimed superior understanding of historical necessity rather than democratic accountability or moral legitimacy. The transformation of grieving individuals and social outcasts into instruments of environmental terrorism demonstrated both the power of extremist ideology to provide meaning and purpose for lives that had been damaged by trauma, disappointment, and the moral responsibility of those who offered such meaning through organizations whose ultimate objectives required the abandonment of basic human compassion and ethical restraint. The relationship between the League of Assassins and various governmental and military organizations revealed the extent to which extremist groups could exploit legitimate institutions and official resources in pursuit of their own agendas, as their infiltration of law enforcement agencies and intelligence services provided them with access to information, equipment, and official sanction that multiplied their effectiveness, while also corrupting the institutions that were supposed to serve and protect the very populations that the League viewed as obstacles to environmental restoration and global ecological balance. The blurring of lines between official counter-terrorism operations and terrorist activities themselves demonstrated how noble objectives could become vehicles for the expression of authoritarian impulses that viewed democratic institutions and individual rights as inconvenient obstacles to effective action rather than as essential safeguards against the abuse of power. The False Face Society represented yet another variation in secret society organization, one that abandoned both the court's commitment to preserving aristocratic privilege and the League's environmental mission in favor of a nihilistic philosophy that viewed all social institutions and moral systems as elaborate deceptions that concealed the fundamental meaninglessness of existence and the arbitrary nature of authority relationships that were maintained through collective agreement to ignore obvious truths about human nature and social reality. Roman Sionis's leadership of this organization reflected both his personal psychological pathology and broader cultural tensions between appearance and reality that characterized urban environments where success and respectability were often achieved through sophisticated forms of deception and impression management that bore little relationship to actual capability or moral worth. The mask symbolism that defined the False Face Society's identity reflected both their philosophical commitment to exposing the artificial nature of social identity and their practical need to conceal their own identities while engaging in criminal activities that challenged established authority and social convention, creating paradoxes and contradictions that revealed the inherent instability of nihilistic ideology when it was translated from abstract philosophical speculation into practical programs of action that required organizational discipline and strategic planning. The masks that concealed members' faces while revealing their true personalities served simultaneously as liberation from social expectations and imprisonment within alternative identities that were often more restrictive and limiting than the conventional roles they had abandoned. The evolution of the false-face society from traditional criminal organization into full-blown cult following Gotham's earthquake disaster demonstrated how traumatic events could accelerate the development of extremist ideology and transform relatively conventional criminal enterprises into revolutionary movements that sought not merely profit or power, but complete transformation of social reality through the systematic destruction of institutions and relationships that provided stability and meaning for ordinary citizens who lacked the philosophical sophistication necessary to embrace nihilistic truth about the fundamental meaninglessness of human existence and social organization. The earthquake that devastated Gotham provided both practical opportunity for expanding criminal operations and symbolic validation for nihilistic philosophy that viewed natural disasters as revelations of cosmic indifference and social vulnerability. The facial disfigurement that became the society's signature practice represented both practical disguise and symbolic commitment to philosophical principles that rejected conventional standards of beauty and social acceptability in favor of brutal honesty about human nature and social reality. Yet this same practice also revealed the sadistic impulses and psychological pathology that had always lurked beneath the surface of nihilistic philosophy when it was embraced by individuals whose moral development had been stunted by personal trauma and social alienation that made them incapable of forming healthy relationships or finding constructive outlets for their intelligence and creativity. The transformation of philosophical rebellion into systematic torture demonstrated how quickly intellectual sophistication could degenerate into primitive cruelty when it was divorced from moral constraints and human compassion. The territorial control that the false-face society established during Gotham's period as no man's land revealed both their organizational capabilities and their fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, as their assumption that chaos and meaninglessness would be welcomed by populations that had been liberated from conventional social institutions was contradicted by the reality that most people sought security, meaning, and community relationships, rather than the freedom from illusion and social constraint that nihilistic philosophy promised to provide. Through the systematic destruction of traditional sources of identity and purpose, the society's brief period of territorial dominance demonstrated that negative ideology could achieve temporary success through superior organization and willingness to employ violence, yet could never provide the positive vision and constructive leadership necessary for building lasting institutions or inspiring genuine loyalty from populations whose cooperation was essential for maintaining social order. The relationship between the various secret societies that operated within Gotham revealed both the competitive dynamics that characterized hidden power structures and the fundamental incompatibility between different approaches to elite, control, and social manipulation. As the court's aristocratic conservatism clashed with the League's environmental radicalism and the false-face society's nihilistic rebellion, creating conflicts that were fought not through open warfare but through subtle influence, operations, and strategic interference with each other's plans and operations. The competition between secret societies demonstrated that even hidden power structures were subject to the same fragmentary pressures and ideological divisions that affected legitimate political organizations, preventing the creation of unified shadow governments that might otherwise have been capable of exercising complete control over democratic institutions and public policy. The law enforcement challenges posed by secret society operations exceeded those created by conventional criminal organizations due to their integration with legitimate institutions and their ability to operate across multiple generations, while maintaining operational security through cultural traditions and initiation practices that ensured member loyalty and organizational continuity regardless of changes in leadership or external pressure from governmental agencies whose investigative capabilities were designed primarily to address criminal enterprises that operated according to more conventional timeframes and organizational structures. The institutional memory and accumulated resources available to secret societies made them far more resilient and adaptable than criminal organizations that depended upon the continued leadership of specific individuals or the maintenance of particular territorial arrangements that could be disrupted through targeted law enforcement operations. The cultural impact of secret society activities upon Gotham's development extended far beyond their immediate criminal enterprises to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between democratic governance and elite influence, the role of inherited privilege in shaping social policy, and the possibility of maintaining popular sovereignty in environments where concentrated wealth and institutional power provided enormous advantages to small groups whose interests might not align with those of the broader population, whose welfare was supposedly protected by constitutional safeguards and electoral accountability that could be circumvented through sophisticated influence operations and long-term strategic planning that operated below the threshold of public awareness and media attention. The architectural legacy of secret society influence upon Gotham's physical development created lasting monuments to their power that would continue to shape urban life long after the original organizations had been eliminated or transformed, as the buildings and infrastructure that they had designed to serve their operational needs also influenced patterns of social interaction and economic development that affected subsequent generations of residents, whose daily lives were constrained by physical environments that had been created to serve purposes that they could never fully understand or appreciate, demonstrating how power exercised across multiple generations could achieve forms of control and influence that exceeded anything possible through conventional political or economic dominance. In the end, the secret societies that had shaped Gotham's destiny from its earliest days represented both the highest expression of human organizational capability and the most dangerous corruption of that same capability when it was divorced from democratic accountability and moral restraint, showing how intelligence and strategic thinking could be employed either to serve human welfare through transparent institutions that protected individual rights and promoted collective prosperity, or to advance narrow interests through hidden manipulation that subverted popular sovereignty, while claiming to serve higher purposes that justified the systematic deception and exploitation of populations whose trust and cooperation were essential for maintaining the very civilization that secret societies claimed to protect and guide through their superior wisdom and enlightened leadership that recognized no authority higher than their own understanding of historical necessity and social order. In the twisted twilight of Gotham's criminal evolution, where traditional concepts of honor and territory gave way to chaos incarnate, where the very notion of organized crime was shattered and reforged in the fires of madness and superhuman capability, there emerged a new breed of criminal dynasty that bore no resemblance to the ethnic families and secret societies that had previously shaped the city's underworld through generations of careful planning and methodical accumulation of power and influence. These were the supervillain empires, organizations built not around bloodlines or cultural traditions, but around the magnetic personalities and extraordinary capabilities of individuals whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of criminal enterprise and the relationship between power and sanity, between genius and madness, between the possible and the inevitable, in a world where the boundaries of human potential had been shattered by science, accident, and the simple refusal to accept limitation as permanent condition. The transformation of Warren White from respectable businessman into the great white shark represented perhaps the most perfect example of how Gotham's unique environment could corrupt even the most conventional and seemingly harmless individuals, demonstrating that the city's capacity for creating monsters was not limited to dramatic accidents or traumatic childhood experiences, but could also emerge from the slow accumulation of moral compromises and ethical shortcuts that gradually eroded character until nothing remained but hunger and the willingness to feed upon others without regard for the consequences or the suffering inflicted upon innocent victims whose only crime was their vulnerability to predators who had learned to disguise their nature behind masks of respectability and professional competence. The financial crimes that had initially brought White to the attention of law enforcement officials were remarkable not for their scale or sophistication, but for their systematic exploitation of trust, relationships, and institutional vulnerabilities that revealed both his understanding of legitimate business practices and his complete contempt for the human costs of his actions. As he transformed pension funds and charitable organizations into personal piggy banks while maintaining the facade of fiscal responsibility and fiduciary duty that convinced his victims to entrust him with resources that represented their hopes for security and dignity in old age. The embezzlement schemes that he constructed were masterpieces of bureaucratic manipulation that demonstrated how thoroughly the criminal mind could corrupt even the most mundane administrative processes when it was guided by intelligence that recognized no moral constraints or ethical boundaries. The plea bargain that resulted in White's incarceration at Arkham Asylum rather than conventional prison reflected both the limitations of traditional criminal justice approaches to white-collar crime and the unintended consequences of mental health defenses that could be exploited by criminals whose understanding of legal procedures exceeded their respect for legal principles, creating situations where the most calculating and cold-blooded offenders could avoid appropriate punishment through claims of psychological disturbance that bore no relationship to their actual mental state yet, which provided strategic advantages that conventional incarceration could not overcome. The irony that White's fraudulent claims of mental illness would ultimately become genuine psychological transformation was lost on a legal system that had been designed to address conventional criminality rather than the unique challenges posed by Gotham's environment. The physical transformation that occurred during White's residence at Arkham demonstrated the asylum's capacity to create the very conditions it claimed to treat, as the experimental procedures and pharmaceutical regimens that were supposed to address his fabricated psychological problems instead induced genuine changes in his physiology and mental state that made him far more dangerous than he had ever been as a mere white-collar criminal operating within the relatively safe confines of corporate boardrooms and financial institutions. The bleached skin and sharpened teeth that gave him his predatory appearance were merely external manifestations of internal changes that had transformed his relationship to violence and his understanding of his own nature and capabilities. The criminal empire that White constructed from within his asylum cell represented a revolutionary approach to organized crime that exploited the unique advantages of his institutional setting, while also demonstrating how intelligence, strategic thinking, could overcome even the most restrictive physical constraints when they were applied by individuals whose commitment to criminal enterprise transcended conventional concepts of freedom and confinement. The network of corruption and influence that he built among asylum staff and fellow inmates provided him with resources and capabilities that exceeded those available to many criminal leaders who operated in conventional urban environments. Without the forced intimacy and institutional vulnerabilities that characterized Arkham's closed community, the alibi that his continued incarceration provided for his criminal activities, represented perhaps the most brilliant strategic innovation in the history of organized crime, as his physical presence within a secure mental health facility made it virtually impossible for law enforcement officials to connect him to criminal activities that occurred throughout Gotham while he remained under constant supervision and medical observation, creating perfect cover for criminal enterprises that could operate with impunity as long as their connection to White remained hidden from investigators, whose assumptions about the relationship between physical location and criminal responsibility prevented them from recognizing the true scope of his influence and control. The psychological profile that emerged from White's transformation revealed an individual who had discovered that his true nature was far more predatory and dangerous than his previous incarnation as a conventional financial criminal had ever suggested, as if his exposure to Arkham's atmosphere had awakened instincts and capabilities that had always existed beneath the surface of his respectable facade, yet which had never found appropriate outlets for expression within the limited opportunities provided by legitimate business environments. The feeding behavior that characterized his relationships with both criminal associates and innocent victims reflected not mere metaphorical predation, but genuine psychological and social dynamics that treated human beings as resources to be consumed rather than individuals deserving of moral consideration. The Penguin's rise from social outcast to crime lord represented a very different trajectory of supervillain evolution, one that transformed childhood trauma and social rejection into fuel for ambitions that exceeded anything achievable through conventional criminal enterprise, demonstrating how personal grievances and psychological wounds could be channeled into organizational capabilities that made their possessor uniquely effective at building and maintaining criminal enterprises that combined traditional elements of territorial control and protection rackets with innovative approaches to violence and intimidation that reflected their leaders' distinctive personality and strategic vision. Oswald Cobblepot's transformation from ridiculed aristocrat into feared criminal mastermind illustrated both the potential for personal reinvention and the dangerous consequences of allowing resentment and desire for revenge to become the organizing principles of entire organizational cultures. The legitimate business enterprises that provided cover for Penguin's criminal activities demonstrated both his understanding of the relationship between legal and illegal commerce and his commitment to building sustainable criminal enterprises that could generate profits and maintain operations across multiple economic cycles and law enforcement campaigns, creating diversified portfolios of legitimate and illegitimate activities that provided both security against official interference and opportunities for expansion into new markets and operational areas that traditional criminal organizations had never successfully penetrated. The iceberg lounge that served as his headquarters represented both symbol and substance of his approach to criminal leadership, combining entertainment venue with fortress, legitimate business with criminal operations center, public face with private reality. The recruitment and training methods that Penguin employed to build his criminal organization reflected his understanding that modern criminal enterprises required not merely loyalty and willingness to commit violence, but also intelligence, creativity, and professional competence that could adapt to changing circumstances and evolving opportunities, leading him to seek subordinates whose capabilities exceeded those typically available to traditional criminal leaders, while also ensuring that their personal loyalty and organizational commitment remained absolute through carefully calibrated combinations of reward, punishment, and psychological manipulation that made betrayal both unlikely and extremely costly for those who might consider it. The gladiator pits that Penguin operated as both training facilities and entertainment venues revealed the extent to which his criminal philosophy had embraced violence, not merely as tool for achieving practical objectives, but as art form and spectacle that provided both personal satisfaction and organizational benefit through the creation of elite fighters whose capabilities exceeded those available through conventional recruitment methods, while also generating revenue and establishing reputation for ruthless efficiency that served strategic purposes in negotiations and conflicts with rival criminal organizations whose leaders understood that Penguin's forces represented qualitatively superior threats compared to typical criminal muscle. The territorial control that Penguin established over Coventry and the Diamond District demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his understanding of the relationship between geographical dominance and economic opportunity, as these areas provided not merely secure bases for criminal operations but also access to legitimate businesses and social networks that could be exploited for both criminal profit and intelligence gathering, creating integrated systems of control that combined traditional protection rackets with sophisticated forms of economic manipulation and political influence that made his organization far more resilient and adaptable than purely territorial criminal enterprises. The overthrow of Penguin's organization by Intergang represented both the inevitable result of his success in attracting attention from more powerful enemies and the fundamental vulnerability that affected all criminal enterprises, built around the charismatic authority and personal capabilities of individual leaders whose removal or defeat could trigger organizational collapse despite the apparent strength and sophistication of the structures they had created. The displacement of local criminal leadership by international organizations with superior resources and technology illustrated broader patterns of globalization and technological development that were transforming criminal enterprise in ways that individual brilliance and personal loyalty could not always overcome. The Joker's criminal organization represented perhaps the most radical departure from traditional concepts of organized crime ever witnessed, abandoning not merely ethnic and territorial foundations, but rational planning and coherent objectives in favor of pure chaos and nihilistic entertainment that treated criminal enterprise as performance art rather than business endeavor, demonstrating how genius-level intelligence could be perverted into instruments of destruction that served no purpose beyond the temporary satisfaction of aesthetic and psychological impulses that recognized no moral boundaries or strategic limitations. The Clown Prince of Crime's approach to criminal leadership challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between organization and effectiveness, showing how apparent madness could become source of strength rather than weakness when it was employed by individuals whose unpredictability and complete disregard for conventional rules made them uniquely effective at achieving objectives that rational criminal leaders would never have attempted. The nihilistic philosophy that guided Joker's criminal activities represented not mere mental illness or psychological pathology, but coherent worldview that viewed existence as elaborate joke, whose punchline was the ultimate meaninglessness of all human effort and moral striving, creating criminal enterprises that sought not profit or power, but proof of chaos as fundamental organizing principle of reality, demonstrating through acts of seemingly random violence and destruction that order and meaning were artificial constructs that could be shattered through sufficient application of creative destruction and theatrical presentation that forced observers to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of civilization and the arbitrary nature of moral systems. The recruitment methods that brought individuals into Joker's organization reflected both his understanding of human psychology and his commitment to transforming criminal enterprise into form of evangelical mission that sought not merely criminal associates, but converts to his philosophical vision of reality as cosmic joke that could only be properly appreciated through abandonment of conventional moral categories and rational strategic thinking, in favor of embrace of chaos as liberating truth that freed consciousness from the burden of meaning and responsibility that made conventional existence unbearable for those intelligent enough to recognize its fundamental absurdity. The impact of Joker's activities upon Gotham's established criminal hierarchy was both profound and lasting, as his systematic destruction of traditional underworld protocols and his complete disregard for territorial agreements and negotiated settlements created conditions of permanent instability and unpredictability that made conventional criminal planning extremely difficult, while also inspiring other criminal leaders to adopt increasingly extreme methods in their efforts to compete for attention and influence within underworld that had been permanently altered by his demonstration that apparent madness could become source of power rather than vulnerability when properly employed. Johnny Frost's role as Joker's primary lieutenant demonstrated both the appeal of charismatic criminal leadership and the psychological costs of prolonged exposure to nihilistic philosophy and chaotic organizational culture, as his transformation from competent professional criminal into devoted follower of Joker's vision revealed how quickly conventional moral categories and rational strategic thinking could be eroded through constant exposure to violence and destruction that serve no comprehensible purpose, beyond entertainment value and philosophical demonstration of reality's fundamental meaninglessness and arbitrary nature. Harley Quinn's evolution from respected psychiatrist into Joker's devoted partner illustrated perhaps the most tragic aspects of supervillain criminal organization, showing how professional competence and genuine desire to help others could be corrupted and perverted through exposure to individuals whose charismatic authority and psychological manipulation could overcome even the most sophisticated understanding of mental health and therapeutic relationship, transforming healers into instruments of destruction while maintaining their conviction that they were serving noble purposes and expressing genuine love through activities that caused immeasurable suffering to innocent victims. The criminal enterprises that operated under Joker's direction defied conventional analysis due to their complete abandonment of profit motive and strategic objective in favor of pure aesthetic and philosophical expression that treated criminal activity as form of performance art designed to communicate messages about the nature of reality and human psychology that could not be conveyed through conventional means, creating situations where traditional law enforcement approaches proved inadequate because they were based upon assumptions about criminal motivation and organizational behavior that had no relevance to enterprises that operated according to entirely different principles and priorities. Two-Face's criminal organization represented yet another variation in supervillain criminal enterprise, one that attempted to systematize randomness and chance through rigid adherence to coin flip methodology that eliminated human judgment and moral consideration from criminal decision-making while maintaining facade of fairness and impartiality that provided psychological comfort for individuals whose commitment to justice had been perverted through traumatic experience and disfiguring injury that had destroyed their capacity for normal moral reasoning and emotional stability. Harvey Dent's transformation from crusading prosecutor into criminal mastermind illustrated both the potential for good intentions to survive even the most devastating personal trauma and the tragic ways in which such survival could become source of additional suffering when it was channeled through damaged psychological mechanisms. The dual nature that characterized Two-Face's criminal activities reflected not mere psychological disorder, but coherent attempt to reconcile competing moral impulses and conflicting desires for justice and revenge through systematic randomization that removed personal responsibility for criminal acts while maintaining illusion of fairness and proper procedure that satisfied deep-seated need for order and legitimacy even within criminal enterprises that violated every principle of legal justice and moral behavior. The coin that determined his decisions represented both surrender of moral agency and assertion of cosmic justice that transcended human understanding and individual preference. The courthouse that Two-Face claimed as headquarters for his criminal organization served both practical and symbolic functions, providing secure base for criminal operations, while also representing his continued identification with legal institutions and judicial processes that had been corrupted through his transformation yet, which retained emotional, psychological significance that influenced his approach to criminal leadership and organizational structure. The choice of location demonstrated both his understanding of symbolic communication and his inability to completely abandon the values and commitments that had defined his pre-traumatic identity. The collaboration between Two-Face's organization and other supervillain criminal enterprises during major crises demonstrated both the potential for cooperation among seemingly incompatible criminal philosophies and the fundamental instability of alliances that were based upon temporary convenience rather than shared values or long-term strategic objectives, as the partnerships that formed during emergencies inevitably dissolved when immediate threats were resolved and individual organizations returned to pursuit of their distinctive goals and methods that were often mutually incompatible. Despite their common opposition to legitimate authority, the gang war that elevated Two-Face's organization to greater prominence within Gotham's criminal hierarchy demonstrated both the effectiveness of systematic methodology and the advantages that accrued to criminal enterprises that could maintain operational discipline and strategic focus even in chaotic environments where less organized competitors were destroyed through their inability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances and unexpected challenges that required forms of leadership and decision-making, capability that pure randomness could not provide despite its apparent fairness and philosophical appeal. Intergang's invasion of Gotham represented the arrival of truly international criminal enterprise with resources and capabilities that exceeded anything available to local organizations, regardless of their individual brilliance or innovative approaches to criminal methodology, demonstrating how globalization and technological development had created opportunities for criminal expansion and influence that transcended traditional territorial boundaries, while also revealing the limitations that affected even the most successful local criminal enterprises when they were confronted by enemies whose operational scale and strategic vision encompassed entire continents rather than individual cities or regions. Bruno Mannheim's leadership of intergang operations in Gotham combined traditional organized crime methods with advanced technology and international resources that made his organization uniquely effective at achieving objectives that local criminal groups had never successfully accomplished, showing how superior equipment and professional training could overcome the advantages that local knowledge and community relationships had previously provided to indigenous criminal enterprises, whose success had been based upon their understanding of specific urban environments and particular cultural contexts that became less relevant as criminal enterprise evolved toward more standardized and technologically sophisticated approaches. The employment of Johnny Stitches as Intergang's local representative demonstrated both their understanding of the importance of indigenous knowledge and connections, and their willingness to work with local criminals whose capabilities and reputation could facilitate their expansion into markets where they lacked direct experience and established relationships, creating hybrid arrangements that combined international resources with local expertise, while also creating potential vulnerabilities through dependence upon subordinates whose ultimate loyalty could not be guaranteed despite immediate alignment of interests and mutual benefit from successful cooperation. The defeat of Penguin's organization and the acquisition of Tobias Whale as local asset demonstrated Intergang's systematic approach to criminal expansion, showing how international organizations could achieve rapid dominance through combination of superior firepower and strategic alliance building that eliminated established competitors while incorporating useful elements from defeated rivals into expanded operational structures that combined international capabilities with local knowledge and established criminal networks that would have taken years to develop through purely organic growth methods. The control of Iceberg Lounge as operational headquarters provided Intergang with both practical advantages and symbolic demonstration of their successful displacement of local criminal authority, yet also created exposure and vulnerability to counterattack from displaced criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies that viewed international criminal expansion as more serious threat than local criminal enterprises that operated within understood parameters and accepted certain limitations on their activities and influence that international organizations were less willing to acknowledge or respect. The return of exiled villains and their assault on Intergang operations revealed both the temporary nature of international criminal success and the resilience of local criminal culture when it was mobilized through shared opposition to foreign domination and cultural displacement, demonstrating that superior resources and advanced technology could not permanently overcome the advantages that local knowledge and community relationships provided to criminal enterprises whose roots were deep enough to survive temporary defeats and tactical setbacks through their ability to regenerate and adapt using resources and support systems that remained hidden from outside observers and international competitors. In the end, the supervillain dynasties that emerged from Gotham's unique environment represented both the ultimate evolution and the inherent contradiction of criminal enterprise in modern urban society, showing how individual brilliance and psychological extremism could create criminal organizations that exceeded traditional limitations, while also revealing the fundamental instability and unsustainability of criminal enterprises that abandoned the cultural foundations and community relationships that had previously provided structure and continuity for illegal activities across multiple generations, leaving behind legacies that demonstrated both the potential and the peril of criminal innovation in environments where traditional rules and boundaries had lost their relevance and restraining power. In the eternal dance between light and shadow that defines Gotham's soul, we witness through these chronicles of criminal dynasties a truth both beautiful and terrible, that every empire built upon corruption carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction, that every throne constructed from the bones of the innocent becomes a monument to the inevitable justice that flows through the universe like blood through ancient veins, unstoppable and absolute in its final reckoning. The families we have encountered in this journey through darkness, from the Roman sophistication of the Falcons to the nihilistic chaos of the Joker's carnival of madness, represent not merely criminal enterprises, but mirror reflections of humanity's eternal struggle between the desire for power and the need for meaning, between the hunger for control and the yearning for connection that transcends the boundaries of law and lawlessness, good and evil, order and chaos. In their rise and fall, we see written the fundamental lesson that power without wisdom is temporary, that strength without compassion is brittle, that all the gold and territory and fear in the world cannot purchase what the human heart truly seeks. The peace that comes from knowing one has chosen light over darkness, when the crucial moment of decision arrived. Sleep now, guardian of justice, and dream of a Gotham where shadows serve the light rather than consuming it.